Dust exploded across the red canyon walls at first light. Riders poured through the narrow throat like a flood of blue coats and steel, rifles cracking, horses screaming as women with bows held the high ground against a force that should never have found this place. One man ran the wrong direction, not toward cover. Straight into the storm, a broken fence post grabbed Wheatgold in both hands, throwing his body between a rifle barrel and a woman who had once pointed an arrow at his heart. The spring had already died weeks before. The cattle were thin. The forged papers still burned inside his coat, proof that someone far away had rewritten a simple escort job into a quiet grave. Gunfire narrowed. Dust swallowed everything. A shot found its mark. He hit the ground hard, blood dark and fast between another woman's fingers, the canyon still roaring around them as the line of defenders refused to break. There is a kind of quiet that only exists after everyone you love is gone. Not the quiet of an empty room. Not the quiet of night falling over a ranch. A different quiet. The kind that lives inside a man's chest and follows him everywhere. Into saloons. Onto horseback. Into sleep, if sleep even comes. Silas Calder had been carrying that quiet for 4 years. He was 34 years old. Broad through the shoulders, sun-cured skin the color of old saddle leather. A jaw that hadn't fully relaxed since the spring of 1874, when a fever took his wife on a Tuesday and his daughter on the Thursday that followed. 2 days. That was all it took. 2 days to turn a house into a grave and a husband, into whatever this was. Whatever a man becomes when the reason he woke up every morning simply stops existing. He didn't talk about it. Didn't drink about it either, not the way some men would. He just rode. Rode from one dusty job to the next, one territory to another, until the towns blurred together, and the only thing that stayed familiar was the weight of a saddle under him and the sound of a horse breathing in the dark. His horse was named Coyote. Gray, stubborn, unbothered by gunfire. He's talked to that horse more in a week than he talked to another human being in a month easy, he'd say, or not yet, or nothing at all. Just his hand on the animal's neck, and that was conversation enough, because that was the thing about grief nobody warned you about. It didn't make you loud. It made you smaller, quieter, until the only voice you trusted was your own, and even that one you kept low, like it might wake something up if you spoke too plain. He told himself he was fine, which was a lie he'd gotten very good at telling. There had been a ranch once. Small, nothing fancy. A house he'd built with his own 2 hands outside, a town called Marrow Creek, board by board, nail by nail, because his wife Eliza had wanted somewhere with the porch facing east so she could watch the sun come up while she drank her coffee. He remembered the smell of fresh-cut pine, remembered her laughing at him for measuring the same board 3 times before he'd trust himself to cut it. He remembered his daughter, too. Ruth, 4 years old when the fever came. Small enough to fit against his chest with room to spare. She used to fall asleep listening to him hum, badly, some tune he didn't even know the name of. He couldn't remember the tune anymore. Had tried. Some nights, lying under open sky with nothing but stars for company, and it wouldn't come. That scared him more than almost anything else. Losing the tune felt like losing her twice. He sold the ranch 6 months after the burying. Couldn't stand the porch. Couldn't stand the east-facing sun. Took what money it brought and turned it into a saddle, a good rifle, and a horse that didn't ask questions, and he'd been moving ever since. Which was, he supposed, its own kind of grave. Just one that kept changing its address. He met Eliza at a church social he hadn't wanted to attend, dragged there by a fellow scout who'd promised there'd be pie and had, for once, told the truth. She'd been serving lemon cake at a table near the back, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something someone said, and Silas, 24 years old, still half a soldier, still mostly a stranger to his own softer edges, had walked straight past 3 other tables just to hear what was so funny. "You're staring," she'd told him, not looking up from the cake. "I'm deciding whether to say something." "Decide faster. Cake's getting warm." "Ma'am, I don't believe cake gets warm." "Everything gets warm, Mr. Calder." Silas Calder. "Everything gets warm, Mr. Silas Calder." If you stand there long enough deciding instead of doing, he'd married her 8 months later. Told himself for years after that it was the fastest decision he'd ever made, and the only one he'd never once regretted. Even now, especially now, some nights he could still hear that voice clear as if she stood behind him. Everything gets warm if you stand there long enough, deciding instead of doing. He wondered sometimes what she'd make of the man he'd become. A man who did nothing but decide these days. Decided which town, Decided which job. Decided, over and over, not to feel any of it too deeply, because deciding to feel it had nearly finished him the first year. He didn't have an answer for what she'd think. Only a feeling, low and persistent, that she wouldn't much care for it. He'd spent the night before in a saloon in Cutter's Bend that smelled like spilled whiskey and older regrets, nursing a single drink for 3 hours because a second one felt like admitting he had nowhere else to be, which he didn't, which was, if he let himself think about it too long, the whole entire problem. A woman at the far end of the bar had tried to make conversation early on friendly, easy, the kind of small talk that used to come naturally to him once. He'd answered in single words until she'd taken the hint and drifted off toward livelier company, and he'd felt, watching her go, and not relief exactly. Something closer to confirmation. Proof, one more time, that whatever part of him used to know how to sit across a table from another living soul and let them in that part hadn't survived the fever either. He'd gone up to a rented room afterward alone, same as always, and lain awake, listening to piano music drift up from downstairs until it finally stopped somewhere past midnight. 4 years of nights just like that one. 4 years of rooms that all looked the same in the dark. The offer came the next morning, in a dust-choked outpost called Cutter's Bend, in a supply office that smelled like tobacco and mildewed paper. A U.S. Army escort job, simple enough on its face. Ride alongside a small wagon detail heading south into Apache country. Protect a civilian specialist, some agent sent to negotiate cattle-raising instruction with a small band camped near the border. Get him there, get paid. Ride on. Silas almost said no. He was tired of army business. Tired of men in blue coats who talked about honor and meant paperwork. But pay was good, and good pay meant he didn't have to think about the next town for a while. Didn't have to think, period. So he said yes. The clerk who handed him his orders was a thin, sweating man named Otis Wexler. Silas didn't recognize him at first. It had been 8 years. 8 years since a younger, hungrier Silas Calder, 26 years old, and still believing the Army meant what it said had. Reported a quartermaster's sergeant for skimming crates of rifles meant for frontier posts and resend them quietly to men who had no business owning them. That sergeant had been Wexler. Wexler had been busted down, shamed, shuffled sideways into a paperwork post in the middle of nowhere, where a man could rot for a decade and nobody would notice. Silas didn't remember his face. Wexler remembered his. Calder, Wexler said, when Silas signed for the assignment. Said it soft. Said it like tasting something sour and deciding to swallow it anyway. Do I know you? Silas asked. No, Wexler said, and smiled in a way that didn't touch his eyes. Reckon you don't. Long ride south, Wexler said, sliding the papers across the desk. You still good with the rifle, Calder? Or has the desert softened you up some? Good enough. That's what they all say. Wexler's fingers drummed the desk twice. Slow. Deliberate. Funny thing about this job, nobody else wanted it. Something about the route not sitting right. But you. He smiled that sour smile again. You strike me as a man who doesn't mind going where nobody else wants to go. I mind plenty of things, Silas said. Money just minds them less. Ain't that the truth? Silas took his orders, folded them into his coat. Didn't think twice. Because why would he? A man doesn't check the ink on his own death warrant. He just signs where he's told and rides where he's pointed. He didn't look back at Wexler on his way out the door, which was, in its own quiet way, the last mistake of the old Silas Calder, the one who still believed paperwork was just paperwork, and that the worst a man like Wexler could do to him was waste his time. The new Silas Calder, the one who'd exist by the end of that week, would never make that mistake again. The detail left Cutter's Bend 2 days later. 3 wagons, 6 soldiers, a civilian named Harmon who talked too much about cattle breeds and not enough about anything real, and Silas, riding ahead, riding behind, riding the long, silent stretches where the desert opened up like something that had forgotten how to end. One of the younger soldiers, a boy barely 20 named Pretty, rode up alongside him the first evening, restless with the particular chatter of someone who hadn't yet learned the desert punishes talkers. You scouted this territory before, Mr. Calder. Some ever see any Apache out this far? Some. Ever fight any? Silas looked at him. Just looked. Long enough that Pretty shifted in his saddle and found something urgent to check in his saddlebag instead. Didn't mean nothing by it, the boy muttered. Never do, Silas said. Tired. Watch the horizon. Not me. Horizon's what's going to keep you breathing out here. Pretty fell back after that, chastened, and didn't try conversation again, which suited Silas fine. He'd learned a long time ago that silence asked fewer questions he didn't have answers for. The land out there did something to a man's mind, flattened it out, made the past feel closer than the present. Silas found himself thinking about the old days, the scouting days, before the fever took everything else that mattered. Back when he rode under a captain named Roland Briggs, who talked about duty like it was scripture and orders like they were sacred. There had been a village once. Silas didn't let himself finish that thought very often. A small Apache settlement, tucked into a canyon much like the one they were riding toward now. Briggs had given the order to fall back during a skirmish that wasn't going their way. Fall back and regroup, he'd said. Except regrouping never happened. Except by the time anyone circled back, there wasn't a village left to defend. Just smoke, and silence, and men who wouldn't look each other in the eye for a long, long time afterward. Silas had carried that morning in his chest ever since. Under the grief for his wife, under the grief for his daughter. An older wound buried deeper, the kind that doesn't scar so much as it hardens. He remembered the smoke most of all, how it had climbed the canyon walls slow, almost lazy, like it had nowhere else to be. How Briggs hadn't looked at any of them on the ride back. How nobody had spoken a single word for 11 miles, because there wasn't a word built yet that could carry what they'd just let happen. Silas had resigned 4 months later. Told himself it was for Eliza. Told himself a lot of things back then. Truth was simpler and uglier than any of it. He'd resigned because he couldn't look at his own reflection in a horse trough without seeing that smoke rising behind his own eyes. He shook the memory off the way he always did, pushed it down, kept riding, which was he was starting to learn, the only trick he really knew. On the 4th night, camped along a dry wash, Silas pulled his orders out to check the route against the stars. Something was wrong with the paper. Not wrong in a way a tired man notices right away. Wrong in a small way. A fold that didn't sit flush. A second layer of ink beneath the first, where a location had been scratched out and rewritten in a hand that almost matched the rest of the document. He held it closer to the fire. The original coordinates were gone. In their place, a canyon 2 days west of where the official camp was supposed to be. A canyon that wasn't on any supply map. A canyon that, as far as the Army's records were concerned, didn't officially exist. Silas sat very still, because a man doesn't rewrite an escort route by accident, because there's no clumsy hand that forges a location out of nowhere, because somebody wanted him somewhere specific and wanted the Army to think he'd simply lost his way. He thought of Wexler's smile, the one that hadn't reached his eyes, which meant somebody back at that dusty outpost office had decided Silas Calder needed to disappear and had built the paperwork to make sure nobody came looking. He didn't tell the others, didn't know yet who to trust, and trusting the wrong man out here could get a person killed faster than any Apache raiding party. So he folded the papers back up, tucked them inside his coat, and made a decision that would have sounded insane to anyone listening. He'd finished the job anyway. Whatever waited for him in that canyon, he'd rather walk into it with his eyes open than turn back and hand Wexler the satisfaction of watching him run. Besides, what did he have to run home to? Nothing. That was the honest answer. Nothing waited for Silas Calder anywhere on this earth. So a trap in a canyon was, in its own strange way, no worse than the life he already had. The canyon revealed itself at dusk on the 6th day, a narrow throat of red rock that opened, unexpectedly, into a wide hidden basin green in patches where a spring still ran, dotted with hide tents and cook fires, just beginning to glow gold against the coming dark. The light did something to the place. Turned the canyon walls the color of a wound just starting to heal, deep red fading to struts, fading to the soft purple of evening settling in behind it. Silas had seen 100 canyons in his years scouting this territory. Something about this one felt different. Quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Older, like the rock itself remembered things it wasn't telling. Silas had left the wagon detail behind that morning, riding ahead alone the way he always did to scout the path first, which, in hindsight, might have saved every life in that convoy, or might have simply meant he was the only one close enough to get caught. He didn't see the first arrow, he heard it. A sound like a whisper cutting past his ear, close enough to stir his hat. "Don't move," a voice called out, a woman's voice, low, certain, the kind of voice that had given orders before and expected them followed. Silas didn't move, because when a person announces they've already got an arrow trained on your heart, the smart thing to do is exactly nothing. They came out of the rocks like the desert itself had grown legs. Women. A dozen at first, then more, stepping from behind boulders and brush with bows drawn, rifles leveled, faces set hard as the stone around them. No men among them. Not one. Silas counted without meaning to. Old habit from scouting days. 30, maybe 40. Some young, some gray-haired. All of them looking at him like he was the last thing standing between them and a nightmare they'd already lived through once. He raised his hands slow, kept his voice level. "I'm alone." "You're not," the leader said. "You just don't know it yet," which struck him, even in that moment, as the strangest thing anyone had ever said to him at gunpoint. He didn't have time to ask what she meant. Didn't have time for much of anything, because two women were already circling wide behind him, closing the gap, boxing him in against a wall of red rock with nowhere left to run, even if running had crossed his mind. It hadn't. A man doesn't outrun 40 arrows. He just stands still and hopes his hands look empty enough, honest enough, to buy him one more minute of breathing. "Off the horse," the same voice said. He looked for its owner and found her at the front. A woman near 30, dark hair pulled back tight. A jagged scar visible along one shoulder where her tunic had slipped. She held her rifle like it was an extension of her own arm, steady, unshaking. "I mean, you no harm," Silas said, sliding down from Coyote's slow hands where they could see them. "They never do," she said, "until they do." They took his rifle, his revolver, the knife in his boot, which surprised him meant somebody in that crowd knew exactly where men like him hid their second weapon. They didn't take his life. Not yet. Which felt in the moment like a mercy that might not last the night. They marched him into the camp between two women holding rope, hands bound in front of him, and every face he passed turned to watch. Not with curiosity, with something colder. Something that had calcified over years of loss into simple, practiced suspicion. He was pushed into a small hide tent at the edge of the camp and left there, wrists still bound, while outside the entire village seemed to erupt into argument. He couldn't understand most of it. Could understand the shape of it, though. The rise and fall. Someone wanted him dead by morning. Someone else wanted answers first. And underneath it all, one voice kept cutting through, calm and hard, the same voice that had stopped him on the trail. At one point, a younger voice, sharp, furious, unmistakably the one who'd spat in the dirt when he'd first spoken, rose above the rest entirely. Silas didn't need the language to understand the shape of that sentence. Understood it in the tone alone. "Kill him now, before he brings the rest." An older voice answered, quieter but somehow carrying further. Something about caution. Something about answers first, bodies after, never the other way around. Because a dead man tells you nothing, and a live one sometimes tells you everything. The argument didn't resolve so much as exhaust itself, voices trailing off one by one until only the crackle of the fire remained outside the tent flap. Silas sat in the dark and listened to strangers debate whether he deserved to live, which was, he thought bitterly, a fairly accurate summary of the last 4 years of his life anyway. Just usually the debate happened quieter, inside his own skull. Some mornings he'd lost that argument too, laying in a bedroll somewhere with a rifle within reach, and wondered, honestly wondered, whether the world would notice if Silas Calder simply stopped showing up to it. He'd never once pulled that trigger. Told himself it was courage. Suspected, most days it was only habit. A body that kept moving long after the man inside it had quit. Funny, he thought now, listening to a whole camp strangers argue passionately over whether his life was worth sparing. Somewhere out there, 40 women who owed him nothing were fighting harder for his survival than he'd fought for it himself in longer than he cared to admit. They brought him before her that night. A fire burning between them, the whole camp gathered in a loose ring around its edges, watching. "Name," she said. "Silas Calder." He said it plain. No flourish. "My orders," said one place. "Somebody changed them. I found the canyon by accident, not by plan." A soldier who doesn't know where he's going. Her mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "That's convenient. I'm not a soldier, not anymore." "Then what are you?" He hesitated. Because how do you answer that honestly, in front of 40 armed strangers when you haven't answered it honestly for yourself in 4 years? "A man who got sent somewhere he wasn't supposed to be," he said finally. Same as it sounds. A younger woman near the fire, 22, maybe, with an unstrung bow across her lap and eyes that hadn't stopped burning since he arrived, spat into the dirt. "Every soldier who ever came near us said something like that," she snapped. "Right before the ones behind him burned everything we had. Ituha, the leader said. A warning, not loud but final. Tuha didn't back down. You believe him, Onawa? So that was her name. Onawa. Silas turned it over once in his mind and said it like a man memorizing the name of a door he might need to find again in the dark. I don't believe anyone, Onawa said. Not yet. She studied Silas across the fire for a long moment, long enough that he felt it in his spine. There are no soldiers riding behind me, Silas said quietly. Whoever changed my orders wanted me gone. Not you found. Convenient story. It's the only one I've got. Silence settled, the fire popped. Somewhere behind Onawa, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and quiet, watchful eyes leaned close and murmured something too low for Silas to catch. Onawa's jaw tightened, but she didn't dismiss it. You'll live 7 days, Onawa said finally. Prove in that time you are not what we fear. Or die on the 8th, and no one here will lose sleep over it. Around the fire, nobody argued. Which told Silas everything he needed to know about how close that vote had already come to going the other way. They untied him but didn't return his weapons. Gave him a corner of a storage tent to sleep in, a single blanket, and a guard posted outside who Silas suspected wouldn't hesitate if he made a wrong move in the dark. He lay on his back and stared at the tent's low ceiling and thought about Wexler's smile again. Because none of this was an accident. Because a forged route doesn't lead a man into a hidden Apache camp by coincidence, it leads him there. Because somebody wanted him removed from the world quietly, by hands that wouldn't be traced back to a supply clerk in Cutter's Bend. Except the plan had a flaw. Silas was still breathing, which meant if he survived the next 7 days, somebody back at that outpost was going to be very unhappy to see him ride back out of this canyon alive. He fell asleep somewhere around that thought, the first real sleep he'd had in weeks. Strange as that was to admit. Strange that the safest he'd felt in years was the night 40 armed strangers decided whether or not to kill him. Morning came hard and bright. They put him to work before he'd finished his first cup of water. A fence needed mending along the eastern edge of camp, where a handful of thin, undernourished cattle grazed inside a corral held together more by hope than by rope. Silas worked in silence, hands blistering fast against unfamiliar wood, while 3 women stood a careful distance away, watching his every move like he might sprout a weapon from thin air. By mid-morning, sweat soaking through his shirt, one of them finally spoke. Older woman, gray threading through dark hair, rifle resting easy across her knees like she'd carried one that way for decades. You're doing the joints wrong, she said. Ma'am? Wrong angle. Post will lean by next season. She didn't move to show him, just watched, arms crossed, waiting to see if he'd argue. He didn't. Reset the post, tried the angle she'd suggested. It held tighter, cleaner, better, she allowed. Which was, Silas suspected, the closest thing to a compliment he was going to get out of anyone in that camp for a good long while. He didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't look too long at any woman who passed. Learned by watching the small unspoken rules of the camp, where a man could walk, where he couldn't, which fire was for cooking and which was sacred and not to be approached at all. By midday, Helona found him. She was 19, small, quick-footed, with a curiosity that outran her caution by a wide margin. She'd been orphaned young. Silas gathered that much from the way the older women watched over her, protective in a way that went beyond simple camp duty. You're doing that wrong, she said, appearing at his shoulder without warning. Silas, startled, recovered. Doing what wrong? The knot, she pointed. It'll slip in a week. He looked at his work. She was right. Show me, he said. And so, in the middle of a camp that had voted on his death the night before, a 19-year-old girl taught a grown man how to tie a proper fence knot, and neither of them mentioned how strange that was. You're not what I expected, Helona said, watching him work the rope right this time. What'd you expect? Meaner. She shrugged. Or scared her. You're neither. Give it a few more days, Silas said. Might change. She almost smiled at that. Almost. You have a family? She asked. Blunt, the way only the very young or the very old ever managed to ask the hardest questions plainly. Silas's hand stilled on the rope. Had one. What happened? Fever. Helona nodded slowly, like that word alone explained everything and nothing at once. I don't remember my parents, she said. Nashota says that's a mercy. Says I don't carry what the older ones carry. Maybe she's right. Maybe. Helona picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. Or maybe not remembering is its own kind of missing something. Just quieter. Silas looked at her for a long moment. 19 years old and already talking like someone twice her age who'd earned every one of those years the hard way. "You're smarter than you let on," he said. "Everyone underestimates the orphan girl," Helona said, standing, brushing dust from her knees. "Works out in my favor more than you'd think." She left him there with that, and Silas found himself, for the first time, in longer than he could remember, almost smiling too. Ituha, watching from a distance with her arms crossed, did not. She crossed the distance instead, boot heels cutting hard lines through the dust, and stopped close enough that Silas set the rope down slow, hands open. What? The old habit of a man who'd learned to read a coming storm before it broke. "You let her get close," Ituha said. Not loud. Quiet enough that only he could hear it. "She got close on her own. Didn't ask my permission. That's the problem." Itua's hand drifted, almost absent, to the knife at her hip. Not a threat. Just a habit of its own, the kind a body falls into after enough years of needing to be ready. "Helona doesn't remember what men like you cost this camp. She was too young." "I wasn't. I'm not asking her to forget anything. Doesn't matter what you ask. She'll forget on her own, given enough kindness. That's how it's." Ituha's eyes, when they finally met his, weren't hateful. They were tired. Bone-tired in a way that went deeper than 7 days of watching a stranger work fences. "I buried my mother 2 winters back. Not from soldiers. From a sickness we didn't have medicine for, because the medicine we used to trade for came from a fort that stopped trading with us the day they decided we were the enemy instead of the neighbors." Silas didn't answer right away. There wasn't an answer that fixed that. He knew that better than most. "I'm not the fort," he said finally. "And I'm not the men who came for your herds, or the soldiers who burned villages, or whoever it was that decided your mother's life was worth less than a trade agreement. I'm just a man who got sent somewhere by mistake, and I'm trying to earn 1 week of trust from people who have every right not to give it to me." Ituha studied him a long moment, jaw working, some old argument playing out behind her eyes that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with every man who'd worn kindness like a mask before this one. "Earn it then," she said finally. "Just don't expect me to make it easy. Wouldn't trust it if you did." That, at least, got something close to a nod out of her before she turned and walked away, leaving Silas standing at the fence line with his pulse only just beginning to slow. The second day looked much like the first, a well-needed deepening, the water table dropping fast under a sun that hadn't shown mercy in weeks. Silas spent hours in the dust and heat, hauling rock and dirt with hands that had gone numb somewhere around noon, working alongside 2 women who spoke to each other in low, fast Apache and to him not at all. Except somewhere past midday, one of them younger, maybe 17 or 18, with a burn scar along her forearm. She never once explained, passed him the water skin without being asked. Small thing. Wouldn't have meant anything most places. Meant something here. He nodded his thanks. She didn't nod back. But she didn't look away either. And out here, what Silas was starting to understand, that counted for something close to conversation. By late afternoon, the well had dropped another feet, and Silas straightened up long enough to feel every one of his 34 years settle into his spine at once. Nashoda, the healer with the silver-streaked hair, brought him water without a word, and studied him while he drank it, the way a person studies a horse they haven't decided whether to trust. "You favor your left side," she said. Not a question. "Old wound." Silas hesitated. "Older than it should be." Nashoda's eyes narrowed just slightly, filing that answer away for later. That evening, exhausted in a way that felt almost good, Silas sat at the edge of camp and watched the fires being lit one by one. Ituha crossed his line of sight, stopped, and glared at him like his mere existence was a personal insult. "You think working a well makes you one of us," she said. "No," Silas said. "I think it makes my hands hurt." She didn't laugh, but something in her face flickered just for a second before she caught it and stamped it back down. "You know what I think," Ituha said. "Reckon you're about to tell me. I think men like you learn to be useful right up until the moment it stops serving you. Then you remember what you really are. And what's that? Dangerous." She said it flat. No heat behind it, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted. "My mother, a man like you once, blue coat kind words, told her he'd bring supplies before winter. What happened? He brought soldiers instead." Ituha's eyes didn't waver. "So don't talk to me about hands hurting. Mine hurt worse, and not from digging wells." Silas had no answer for that. Didn't try to find one. "Don't get Comfortable, she said, and walked away before he could speak at all. Silas watched her go, and thought, not for the first time, that anger like hers didn't come from nowhere, didn't come from him at all, really. Came from somewhere much older, much deeper, a wound he hadn't caused, but might still be paying for, which was, he supposed, how most grudges worked. The third day nearly ended everything. It started with dust on the horizon a rider's worth, then more, then the unmistakable low thunder of hooves moving fast toward the horse herd, grazing along the canyon's outer edge. Hide hunters. 4 of them, white men with rifles, and the particular careless cruelty of men who decided the world owed them whatever they could take from it. The camp scattered into motion. Women grabbing bows, rifles, knives, a defense assembled in seconds that told Silas this wasn't the first time. Wouldn't be the last either. Silas was still unarmed. Still, technically, a prisoner. He didn't think about that for more than a heartbeat. He grabbed a fence post, the closest thing to a weapon within reach, and ran for the herd anyway, because horses were screaming, and women he barely knew were running toward gunfire instead of away from it, and something in him simply would not let that happen without him in the middle of it. Calder, Onawa's voice somewhere behind him, sharp with alarm. He didn't stop, because stopping was the old Silas Calder's habit. Stopping was what he'd done on a hillside 8 years ago while smoke climbed a canyon wall he wasn't there to defend. Not this time. Except this time wasn't his to fix either. Some cold logical part of his brain kept insisting even as his legs kept carrying him forward. Except that part of his brain had never once stopped him from running toward gunfire before, so it wasn't about to start now. The dust swallowed everything. Horses screaming, high and terrified, scattering in every direction. A rider bearing down fast on a girl no older than 16 who'd frozen mid-stride, bow half raised, eyes wide as saucers. Silas didn't think, didn't have time to. Just ran the angle, put himself between the horse and the girl, and swung the fence post up hard into the rider's chest as the animal thundered past. The man went backward off his saddle like he'd hit a wall. The hide hunters hadn't expected resistance this organized. Hadn't expected a man to come charging out of the dust either, swinging a fence post like it was the only thing standing between them and a very bad afternoon. A second rider wheeled toward him, rifle coming up. Silas closed the distance before the barrel leveled, cracked the post across the man's forearm hard enough to send the rifle spinning into the dirt, ducked a third man's swing, drove a shoulder into him and put him flat on his back in the sand, air driven clean out of his lungs. The fourth hunter hesitated, and hesitation, out here, was its own kind of surrender. He didn't kill anyone, could have, chose not to. Because there'd been enough killing in his life already, and something about this camp, about women who'd already buried too much, made him want, badly, to be the kind of man who left instead, a warning instead of a body. Get, he said, low and hard, standing over the last hunter, with a rifle now in his own hands, taken from the dirt, and don't come back. They didn't argue. 4 men on horseback, disappearing back the way they'd come, dust settling slow behind them. Silas turned around to find the camp staring at him, not with suspicion this time, with something closer to disbelief. Onawa reached him first, rifle still in hand, chest heaving from the run across camp. For a moment neither of them said anything. She looked at the 4 riders retreating into dust, then at him, then at the fence post still gripped white-knuckled in his hand. You could have been killed, she said. So could she. He nodded toward the 16-year-old, now being fussed over by 2 older women, shaking but unhurt. Didn't seem like a fair trade to sit that one out. Onawa's eyes searched his face for a long moment, like she was looking for the lie in it and couldn't find one. Nobody asked you to fight for us, she said, quieter now. Nobody had to. She didn't answer that, just held his gaze a beat longer than the moment strictly required, then turned to bark orders at the women still gathering the scattered herd, and the moment folded itself back into the ordinary chaos of a camp catching its breath. That night, for the first time, a few of the women spoke to him directly at the fire. Not warmly, not yet, but directly, which felt like its own kind of victory. Halona sat close, practically glowing with the thrill of it. You could have shot them. Could have. Why didn't you? Silas looked into the fire a long moment before answering. Man who kills easy, he said, usually forgets why he started. I've forgotten enough already. Didn't want to forget that too. Halona didn't fully understand that answer. He could see it in her face. But she nodded anyway, like she sensed the weight in it, even if the shape of it stayed out of reach. Across the fire, Onawa watched him without a word, Day 4 brought different work. The cattle, thin, few, and badly in need of proper care, became Silas's responsibility, and for the first time since arriving, he found something close to purpose in the labor. He showed the younger women how to check hooves for rot, how to read a sick animal's eyes, how to ration feed through a season that hadn't given them nearly enough of it. "This one," he said, kneeling beside a sway-backed heifer, running a hand along its ribs, "won't make it through the month unless you separate her from the rest. She's giving what little she's got to the calf. Needs her own feed or you'll lose them both." Helena knelt beside him, watching close. "How do you know all this?" "Grew up on a ranch, before the army. Before all of it." He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Man forgets a lot of things. Doesn't forget how to read an animal that's dying slow." "Sounds like something else too," Helena said. "Too innocent to be entirely innocent." Silas answered that, just moved on to the next animal, and let her small, knowing smile follow him without comment. By afternoon, 3 of the younger women had gathered to watch and learn, taking turns checking hooves under his direction, laughing, actually laughing, a sound Silas hadn't yet heard in this camp, when one heifer took exception to the whole process and nearly put a hoof through someone's boot. Even Atuha watched from a distance, arms crossed, though she was careful never to come close enough to be counted among the students. It was during this work that Nashota finally sat him down, unbidden, and pulled his shirt back from his shoulder to look properly at the old wound she'd noticed days before. A long scar, pale and puckered, ran from his collarbone down across his ribs. "Bullet," she said, not asking. "Long time ago." "Not the wound, I mean." Her eyes lifted to his. "That one's old too. But it's not the one that's killing you slow." Silas said nothing. "I've seen this before," Nashota went on, quiet, working salve into skin that didn't need it anymore. Just needed the excuse of her hand staying near him a little longer. "Man who survives one thing and can't forgive himself for it." "You don't know what I survived." "No," she agreed. "But I know the way you hold your shoulders, like you're still bracing for something that already happened." Silas's jaw worked. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence between them stretched thin enough that even the fire seemed to hold its breath. "My wife," he said finally, voice rough, "and my daughter. Fever took them both inside 2 days. I wasn't there when it happened, was out on a job. Came home to a house that wasn't a home anymore." Nashota's hands stilled. 4 years, Silas said. 4 years, and I still walk into a room sometimes expecting to hear her voice. Except she's not there. Except she's never going to be there again. And I keep waiting for that to stop hurting, and it just doesn't. "It's not supposed to stop," Nashota said gently. "It's supposed to change shape. That's different." Silas looked up at her, something raw moving behind his eyes. "You lost people too," he said. "Not a question. Everyone in this camp lost people," she said simply. "That's why we're a camp of women instead of a camp of family." She paused, hands finally going still against his shoulder. "I had a husband, 2 sons. Soldiers came through 6 years back, looking for a different band entirely. Wrong camp. Wrong war. Didn't matter to them. A camp of Apache men looked the same as any other from the wrong end of a rifle. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry." She said it without bitterness, just fact, worn smooth from being said and heard too many times to carry sharp edges anymore. "Sorry doesn't dig a well. Doesn't mend a fence. I stopped needing sorry a long time ago, Calder. What I needed was to learn how to keep breathing anyway. Still learning it most days. Does it get easier?" "No." She met his eyes. Steady, unflinching. "It gets familiar. That's not the same thing, but it's what you get." She tied off the bandage he didn't need. "Grief doesn't make you weak, Calder. It makes you honest. Question is whether you let it make you useful, or whether you let it bury you standing up." She's left him with that, walking away into the gathering dusk, and Silas sat alone with words that had found a crack in him nobody had managed to find in 4 long years. Before that, though, came something Silas hadn't expected at all. That same evening, the whole camp gathered for a meal, shared communally, thin stew mostly, stretched to feed 40 mouths from ingredients meant for half that many, but shared without complaint or hesitation. Names moved around the fire that Silas hadn't learned yet. Stories too, some told outright, some only hinted at in the way a woman's voice caught on a particular word, or the way another reached over, without looking to steady her neighbor's hand. He learned that night that this camp buried its dead differently than he'd been taught to. No stone markers, no names carved anywhere permanent. Just a small fire lit each new moon, and every woman present speaking one memory aloud into the flame, so that grief moved through the whole camp instead of staying locked inside any single chest. We don't let sorrow live alone here, Nishota told him, catching him, watching the ritual from the edge of the firelight. Alone it curdles, shared it just aches. Different thing entirely. Silas thought of 4 years spent carrying Eliza and Ruth by himself, in silence, in saddlebags, in empty hotel rooms, and the backs of horses that couldn't talk back. Might be onto something, he said quietly. Might be you should try it sometime, Nishota said. Before it curdles. She left him with that, and the fire burned low, and one by one the camp dispersed toward their tents, until only a handful of shapes remained silhouetted against the embers. The fireside conversation with Onawa happened later that same night, though neither of them planned it that way. She simply sat down across from him, uninvited, and for a long while neither spoke at all. You didn't have to fight those men, she said eventually. Could have stayed hidden. Let us handle it. Nobody would have blamed you. Didn't feel like a choice. Everything's a choice. Silas considered that. Then I chose it because standing still while people I don't even know yet get hurt, that's a thing I can't do anymore. Tried it once. Stood still when I shouldn't have. Cost more than I ever paid it back. Onawa's eyes sharpened, curious despite herself. What? He almost told her. Almost let the whole 8-year-old wound spill out into the firelight, the village, the retreat order, Briggs, the smoke on the horizon that never left his memory, no matter how many years he put between himself and it. He didn't. Not yet. Some things needed more trust than 5 days could build. Long story, he said instead. For another fire. Onawa accepted that without pushing, which surprised him. The men who did this to us, she said instead, gesturing loosely at the camp around them, at the absence that lived in every corner of it, they came in uniforms. Some of them. Others came for hides or gold, or just because a camp of women looked like something easy to take from. We stopped being easy a long time ago. I noticed. We lost husbands, brothers, fathers. Her voice didn't shake, but something underneath it did. 3 years now since the last man in this camp died defending it. 3 years of doing everything alone that used to take 2 hands to do. You've done it, Silas said. Whatever it cost. You're still standing. Standing isn't the same as living. She looked at him, then really looked, in a way that made the fire between them feel smaller than it was. You'd know something about that. Silas held her gaze. Yeah, he said quietly. I would. You lost someone, everyone. I had. The words came out plainer than he'd meant them to. 4 years of practiced silence undone in a single breath by a woman who hadn't even asked twice. Wife. Daughter. Fever took them both while I was 200 miles away, earning wages I didn't need anymore by the time I got home. Onawa didn't offer comfort, didn't reach for him, didn't soften her voice into something pitying. She just nodded, slow, like she was setting his grief down next to her own, and finding, somewhere in the comparison, not competition, but company. Nishota says grief doesn't leave, she said. Says it just learns to sit quiet in a corner, so you can still function around it. She said something like that to me too. She says it to everyone. Doesn't make it less true. Onawa poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark. For a long time I thought running this camp meant I couldn't afford to feel any of it. Thought grief was a luxury for people who still had someone left to catch them if they fell apart. And now? Now I think maybe that was just fear wearing a braver name. She glanced at him sideways. You said you tried standing still once, when you shouldn't have. Silas's jaw tightened. The fire popped between them, and for a moment he weighed just how much of that old wound he was willing to hand a woman he'd known 5 days. There was a village, he said finally. Long time before the fever. I was scouting under a captain who gave the order to fall back during a skirmish. Told us we'd regroup, come back stronger. By the time we came back, there wasn't anything left to come back for. Onawa went very still. I've hated myself for that morning longer than I've hated myself for anything else, Silas said. Longer even than for not being home when Eliza got sick. Because that one, I could tell myself, was bad luck. This one was a choice I let someone else make for me, and I've spent 8 years wondering what would have happened if I'd disobeyed that order instead of following it. Would it have saved them? Don't know. Into the flames. That's the part that eats at a man. Not knowing. Just carrying the maybe around. Forever. Onawa was quiet for a long moment. You're not the only one carrying a maybe, she said eventually. This whole camp is built on maybes. Maybe if we'd left sooner. Maybe if we'd fought harder. Maybe if the men had stayed instead of riding out that last time. She shook her head slowly. Doesn't change anything, turning it over and over. Just wears a person smoother, like a stone in a river. Is that what you are? Silas said. A stone in a river. For the first time since he'd arrived, something close to a real smile touched the corner of Anawa's mouth. Careful, Calder. Almost sounded like a compliment. Wasn't not one. She studied him a moment longer, firelight catching the scar on her shoulder, and something in her expression softened just enough for him to notice. Standing isn't the same as living, she said again, quieter, this time, almost to herself. Maybe neither of us has figured out the difference yet. Neither of them said anything else that night. Didn't need to. Something had shifted, small and quiet, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but changes the shape of everything that comes after. Ituha remained unmoved. She watched the fireside conversations from a distance, jaw tight, and cornered Silas the next morning, while he worked, alone, checking fence line at the camp's edge. She's letting her guard down, Ituha said, no greeting. Onawa, around you, didn't notice. Liar, Itua's eyes were hard as flint. I've watched this camp bury too many people to watch it get soft over a man who showed up with a forged letter and a sad story. It's not a story, Silas said, keeping his voice even. And I never asked anyone to go soft on my account. Doesn't matter what you ask for. She stepped closer, unafraid, the way only someone with nothing left to lose could be. It matters what happens after, every time. Somebody trusts. Somebody dies. That's the pattern out here. I've seen it play out more times than I can count. Then break the pattern, Silas said. Or don't trust me. I can live with that. But don't punish the whole camp for hoping something might be different this time. Itua's mouth twisted, somewhere between fury and something that looked almost like grief. Hope's a luxury, she said. We buried that a long time ago, too. She walked away before he could answer, leaving Silas standing alone at the fence line with the desert stretching out gold and endless in every direction, and the uncomfortable sense that Ituha's anger wasn't really about him at all, was about every man who'd worn a kind face foreshowed the other one. Which meant, if he wanted to earn her trust, he wasn't just fighting his own reputation. He was fighting the ghosts of every man who'd broken this camp before he ever arrived. That afternoon, Anawa found him checking the herd along the far ridge, alone, farther from camp than the terms of his watch strictly allowed. You're supposed to stay close, she said, though she made no move to enforce it. Ridge has a clear view of the pass. Seemed worth knowing what's coming before it arrives. Old scout habit. Old scout habit, he agreed. She fell into step beside him without being asked, and for a while they walked the ridge together in a silence that had, somewhere over the last 6 days, stopped feeling dangerous and started feeling almost companionable. You ever think about after, she asked eventually. After what? After the watch ends. After we decide you've earned your place, or decide you haven't. You ever think about where you'd go if this canyon spat you back out tomorrow? Silas considered the question longer than it probably deserved. No, he admitted. Every other job. Every other town. I always had the next one lined up before I'd finished the last. Something to ride toward, even if it was just another version of the same nowhere. He looked out over the basin, green in patches, gold everywhere else. Don't have that here. Don't much want it, if I'm honest. Anawa's eyes stayed on the horizon, but something in her posture eased. Just slightly at that answer. This land doesn't forgive easy, she said. Doesn't forget either. You'd be signing on for more grief before you're through, not less. Already got plenty of that. Might as well spend it somewhere it does some good. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had at the fire 2 nights before. That's either the wisest thing you've said since you got here, Calder, or the most foolish. Been accused of both plenty of times. Usually in the same week. The ghost of a laugh escaped her, quick, surprised. Gone almost before it arrived, like she wasn't yet sure she was allowed one. It was, Silas thought, the finest sound he'd heard in 4 years. They didn't speak again the rest of the walk back. Didn't need to. The silence between them had changed shape sometime in the last 6 days. Same as the grief Nashoda kept telling him about. And Silas was beginning to suspect the two were not entirely unrelated. That night, alone in the storage tent, Silas pulled the forged orders out again and studied them by the thin light of a single candle stub, because something about the handwriting still bothered him. Bothered him the way a splinter bothers a hand, small enough to ignore for an hour, impossible to ignore for a week. He'd looked at this paper a dozen times since the desert, told himself each time he'd already learned everything it had to teach him. Except he hadn't, not quite. He held it closer to the flame and saw it at properly for the first time a corner of the page, folded under itself so many times it had nearly torn away entirely. A second scrap of paper tucked inside the fold like a man hiding a second lie inside a first one. He worked it free with careful fingers, heart beating a little too fast for a piece of paper. A requisition slip, half burned at one edge like somebody had meant to destroy it and gotten interrupted before they finished the job. Crates of rifles, numbered, dated 3 weeks back. A signature at the bottom, smudged but legible enough. Wexler. Silas sat very still, which meant this wasn't only about an old grudge over a demotion 8 years gone, which meant Wexler was still doing exactly what he'd been caught doing the first time, only smarter now, only better hidden. And Silas Calder had very nearly become the loose thread that got pulled to unravel the whole operation. Until somebody decided the easiest fix wasn't silencing him quietly back in Cutter's Bend. The easiest fix was sending him somewhere he'd simply never be found again. Silas folded the scrap back into the papers and tucked them deep inside his coat, hands not quite steady. Because if he was right, and some cold, certain part of him was already sure he was. Then this canyon wasn't the end of Wexler's plan. It was only the part of the plan that hadn't worked yet. And a man like Wexler, caught once already, wasn't the kind to leave a job half-finished. Silas blew out the candle and lay back in the dark mind, turning the pieces over and over, and didn't sleep for a long while. The 7th day came the way most turning points do, quietly, almost without anyone noticing it had arrived until it was already there. Silas woke before dawn out of habit, half expecting a guard's rifle at the tent flap, half expecting nothing at all. Neither happened. He lay still a while, listening to the camp stir awake around him, women's voices low over cook fires, the soft complaint of the herd waiting to be fed, the ordinary sounds of a place that had, somewhere in the last week, stopped feeling like a cage and started feeling like something closer to a home he hadn't earned yet. He spent the day the way he'd spent the 6 before it, fixed what needed fixing, watched the horizon out of old habit, said little, listened much, except everything felt different now, waited, like the whole camp was holding its breath along with him, waiting for the sun to drop low enough to call the question that had been circling since the moment he'd been marched in at the point of 40 arrows. By the time the fire was lit that evening, Silas had stopped pretending he wasn't afraid of the answer. The camp gathered that evening around the central fire. All of them, women who had watched Silas mend fences and dig wells and fight off hide hunters and sit with their grief without flinching from it. Anawa stood before them, and Silas stood a little apart, hands folded, waiting on a verdict he genuinely didn't know the shape of. 7 days, Anawa said, addressing the whole camp, though her eyes kept finding Silas and holding there a beat too long. We said he'd prove himself or die on the 8th. I want to hear it plain. Who believes he's proven it? Hands rose, slowly at first. Then more. Halona's shot up almost before the question finished. Nashota's followed, calm and certain. Even a few of the older women who'd said nothing to Silas all week lifted their hands, silent testimony to something they'd watched from a distance, and decided quietly to trust. Atuha's hand stayed down. I'm not saying trust him, she said, when every eye turned to her. I'm saying she stopped. I'm saying watch him. Every day. The way you'd watch a storm that hasn't decided yet if it's passing through or settling in. That's fair, Onawa said. And then to the whole gathering he stays. For now. On watch. Earning it every day, same as anyone here has to. A murmur ran through the camp, not celebration, nothing that warm, but something that felt, to Silas, like the first real breath he'd taken since Wexler had handed him those forged orders back in Cutter's Bend. He caught Anawa's eye across the fire. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. Halona found him after the crowd thinned, grinning like she'd personally won an argument. Told you, not what I expected. You didn't tell me anything. You just glared less. Same thing, coming from me. She bumped his shoulder with hers. Quick, easy, the kind of gesture that belonged between siblings more than strangers. Welcome to the watch, Calder. Try not to die. Nashota will be unbearable if she has to patch you up again. I'll do my best. Do better than your best, Halona said, already walking away. We don't have a lot of room left for losing people out here. Even Atuha, passing him at the fire's edge on her way to her tent, paused just long enough to speak. Watch, she reminded him. Flat. unsmiling every day. Wouldn't have it any other way, Silas said. She almost huffed something that might have been amusement and kept walking. Later that night, alone at the edge of camp with Coyote, nosing at his shoulder for the first time in a week, Silas allowed himself to think about what came next. He was alive, sheltered, however cautiously, by people who owed him nothing and had every reason to hate the uniform he used to wear, even if he wasn't wearing it now. He'd found, somehow, in the last place on earth he expected it, something that felt almost like footing. But the forged orders were still folded inside his coat, still proof that somebody wanted him gone, permanently, and quietly enough that nobody would come looking. Wexler's face floated up in his memory again, that thin, sour smile, and Silas knew, with the certainty of a man who'd survived enough betrayals to recognize the shape of one forming, that this wasn't over. Whoever wanted him dead in this canyon wasn't going to simply give up, because the canyon had decided instead to let him live. Somewhere out past the ridgeline, past the dry riverbeds and the long empty miles back to Cutter's Bend, a plan was still moving. Silas didn't know its shape yet, didn't know how deep it ran, or how many hands were dirtied by it, or how much worse it was about to get before it got better. He only knew one thing for certain, standing there under a sky full of more stars than he'd let himself notice in 4 long years. Whatever came next, he wasn't running from it. Not this time. He'd done enough running to last 2 lifetimes. And for the first time since the fever took everything that used to matter to him, Silas Calder found himself standing somewhere he actually wanted to stay and fight for, even if it killed him, especially if it did, because a man who has already lost everything once learns something most people never do, learns that the fear of losing it again is not, in the end, a reason to never hold anything at all. It is only the price of holding something worth the risk. Coyote nudged him again, patient, unbothered, and Silas rested a hand against the animal's neck and looked out at the small fires still burning across the basin. 40 women who had voted, against every hard lesson their lives had taught them, to trust a stranger one day longer. Somewhere past the ridgeline, he knew Wexler was still out there, still moving pieces Silas couldn't yet see. The forged orders in his coat were proof enough that whatever came next wouldn't arrive gently and wouldn't arrive alone. But for tonight, under more stars than he'd let himself count in 4 long years, Silas Calder allowed himself something he hadn't dared allow in all that time. He allowed himself to hope. Quietly, carefully, the way a man learns to hope again after he's already buried it once. And somewhere across the dying fires, if he'd looked, he might have seen Onawa still awake too, watching the same stars, wondering the same thing he was. Whether this canyon, against every odd either of them could name, had just become something worth defending with everything they had left. The spring died first, not all at once. Water doesn't disappear that way. It thins, recedes, pulls back from the edges of a basin like something ashamed of leaving, until one morning a woman kneels where there used to be a pool and finds only cracked mud staring back at her. That morning came 3 weeks into Silas Calder's watch. 3 weeks. He'd started counting them without meaning, to the way a man counts anything that feels too good to trust completely. 3 weeks of mended fences and deepened wells. 3 weeks of Halona's easy chatter, Nishota's quiet watchfulness, Ituha's guarded distance that hadn't quite thawed but had, at least the currents, stopped freezing him out entirely. 3 weeks of evenings at the fire with Onawa that had started meaning something neither of them had found the courage to name yet. 3 weeks was not very long in the grand accounting of a life. Except it was longer than Silas had let himself stay anywhere, mean anything to anyone, in 4 straight years, which made it feel, some mornings, like the longest stretch of time he'd ever lived through. He stood at the spring's edge with Onawa, both of them looking down at ground that used to hold water deep enough to swim in. Neither spoke for a long while, because there wasn't a comfortable way to say what they were both already thinking, because a camp without water wasn't a camp. It was countdown. "How long?" Onawa said finally. "Cattle can hold 2 weeks on what's left in the low troughs. Maybe 3 if we ration hard." Silas crouched, pressed a hand into the cracked mud. "Dry clean through. People can hold longer. Won't be pleasant, and after 3 weeks." He didn't answer that right away. Didn't need to. They both understood the shape of the silence well enough. "There's another source," he said finally. 2 days west. Spring fed deep. Doesn't run dry even in a bad year. I scouted it once, years back, before any of this. Why haven't you mentioned it before now?" Because moving 40 people in a herd across open desert isn't a decision you make lightly. And because I wasn't sure, until this morning, that you'd trust me enough to follow me there. Onawa's eyes cut to him, sharp. Do I have a choice? Everyone's got a choice. Silas stood, brushing dust from his palm. Just some choices get harder to walk away from than others. The council gathered that evening. Every woman in camp crowded into the space around the central fire, voices overlapping in argument long before Onawa raised a hand for quiet. We moved the herd, she said, west, to the second spring. Calder knows the route, and if soldiers find us on open ground, someone called from the back, with nothing but sky for cover, then we're no worse off than staying here and dying slow instead of dying fast, Onawa said flat, final. An older woman near the front, one Silas had come to know only as a steady, watchful presence at the well, spoke next, her voice measured but firm. We've moved before twice, since I've been alive to remember it. Both times, we lost someone on the crossing. Sickness or soldiers or simple bad luck. Moving isn't safety. It's a different flavor of risk. Staying is a certainty, Onawa answered. Moving is only a risk. I'll take the risk over the certainty every time. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered women, though not everyone nodded along. A younger voice, sharp with fear rather than defiance, cut through the crowd. What if the second spring isn't there anymore either? What if we cross 2 days of open desert for nothing? Then we'll be no worse off than we are right now, Silas said quietly, the first words he'd spoken all evening. Every head turned toward him, 40 pairs of eyes weighing a man who still, 3 weeks in, hadn't fully earned the right to speak first in this circle. But I scouted that spring myself years back. Deep-fed, not surface-fed. The kind that outlasts drought because it's not drawing from the same dying sky everything else is. And if you're wrong, then I'll have led you into worse than what you're already facing, and you'll have every right to never trust a word out of my mouth again. He held the woman's gaze steady. But I've scouted 100 miles of this territory, ma'am. I don't stake other people's lives on guesses. Itua hadn't spoken all evening, sat near the fire's edge with her arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past the flames, like she was watching something no one else in the circle could see. Silas noticed, filed it away. Didn't ask because asking Itua anything directly these days tended to close doors instead of opening them. The vote passed, narrow but real. They'd move in 3 days' time. Once the weakest of the cattle were strong enough to survive the crossing. 3 days. Silas turned that number over in his mind that night, lying awake in the storage tent, and something about it itched at him, the way the folded corner of a forged letter once had. 3 days was exactly enough time for trouble to find them first. He found the dust the next morning, scouting though on the ridge alone before dawn out of old habit. A column of it, thin and distant, rising off the eastern approach where no wind should have been kicking anything up at all. Silas dropped flat against the rock and watched it for the better part of an hour, counting shapes as they resolved out of the haze. Riders. A dozen, maybe more. Army blue, unmistakable even at this distance, moving with the deliberate, like unhurried pace of men who weren't lost. Men who knew exactly where they were headed. He didn't wait, to be sure. Ran the ridge back to camp at a pace that left his lungs burning, and found Onawa already moving toward him, drawn by something in his stride that told her the news before he opened his mouth. Soldiers, he said, east approach. Half a day out, maybe less. How many? Enough. Onawa's face didn't change, not the way a lesser woman's might have, but something behind her eyes went very still, the stillness of someone doing fast, hard arithmetic on how much time was left and coming up short. You said this canyon wasn't on any map, she said. It wasn't. Wexler's forged orders put it there, which means somebody with access to Army correspondence knows exactly where to find it now, whether they meant to share that or not. Or someone talked. Silas agreed grimly. He rode out that afternoon alone against Onawa's objection, close enough to the approaching column to make out details a half-mile couldn't hide from a trained eye. The lead rider sat his horse the way certain men always did, spine too straight, chin too level, the posture of someone who'd built an entire identity out of never once looking uncertain in front of subordinates. Silas's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to why, because he knew that posture. Had followed it up a dozen canyons just like this one, 8 years and a lifetime ago, back when following orders still felt like the safest thing a man could do with his conscience. Captain Roland Briggs, older now, grayer at the temples, heavier through the middle, but unmistakably the same man who'd once looked at a burning village from a safe distance and called the retreat that let it burn. The memory came up fast and unwelcome, the way old wounds do when pressed. Silas remembered the exact pitch of Briggs's voice that morning, calm, almost bored, like the order cost him nothing at all. Fall back, regroup. We'll return with reinforcements. Remembered his own voice, younger and smaller than it had any right to be, arguing that there wasn't time, that reinforcements were half a day out, and the village had none. Remembered Briggs's flat, final answer. That's an order, Corporal. Not a debate. He remembered riding away. That was the part that still woke him some nights. 4 years after Eliza, 8 years after the smoke. Not the burning itself, he hadn't seen that. Had been half a mile gone by the time it started. What he remembered, what never left him, was the riding away, the choosing not to look back, the particular cowardice of a young man who told himself obedience was the same thing as innocence. It wasn't. He'd learned that the hard way, turning it over on 1,000 lonely nights since. Silas lay against the rock a long time after the column passed below, not moving, barely breathing, feeling 8 years of buried grief claw its way back up through his chest all at once, which meant this wasn't only about a hidden camp anymore, which meant the universe, or fate, or whatever cruel hand arranged these things, had decided to hand Silas Calder a second chance at the exact morning that broke him the first time. Except this time, there was no order coming down from above him. This time, if anyone was going to decide whether to stand and fight or fall back and let it burn, it was going to be him. He didn't tell the whole camp what he'd seen. Told Onawa. Only Onawa, sitting across from her at the fire once the rest had gone quiet for the night, voice low enough that the words wouldn't travel past the two of them. You know him, she said. Not a question served under him. 8 years back. Silas stared into the flames like they might burn the memory out of him if he looked long enough. There was a village, not unlike this one. He gave the order to fall back during a skirmish, told us we'd regroup, come back stronger, and by the time we came back there wasn't anything left to come back for. His jaw worked. I've spent 8 years hating a man I never had the courage to disobey. And now he's riding straight toward the only thing I've found worth standing my ground for since. Why do you think he's here? Truly here. Not the official reason officially. He's hunting a hidden camp reported by scouts. Silas shook his head. Slowly. But Wexler forged my orders to send me here. And Wexler answers to somebody, same as every clerk in every outpost answers to somebody. I don't think this is coincidence, Onawa. I think somebody wanted this canyon found, and wanted me buried in the finding of it. Why? Don't know yet. Wish I did. He turned the thought over again, the way he had every night since finding that scorched requisition slip. Wexler's still moving rifles. I found proof of it folded inside my own forged orders. Man doesn't a smuggling operation quiet forever without powerful people looking the other way for him. Maybe Briggs is one of those people. Maybe he's just following orders same as I once did, blind to what he's really riding into. I don't know which is worse. Does it matter which? Matters to me. Silas's voice dropped. Rougher now, because if Briggs is dirty, then this is a fight I can end clean, once and for all. But if he's just another good man following bad orders, same as I was. He stopped himself. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Onawa watched him a long moment, something perceptive and unhurried in her gaze. You're afraid of becoming him, she said quietly. Afraid that if you hesitate, even once, you'll be the one calling a retreat that costs someone their life. Silas said nothing, which was answer enough. You won't, she said. I've watched you 3 weeks now, Calder. You don't run from what's hard. You run toward it usually faster than good sense recommends. That's supposed to be a compliment. It's an observation. The corner of her mouth lifted just barely. Compliments cost extra. Onawa was quiet a long moment. Then don't fall back this time, she said simply. Wasn't planning on it. Good. She held his gaze, something fierce and steady passing between them, because I don't intend to lose this camp to the same mistake twice, Calder. Not his, not yours. Tua slipped out of camp again that night. Halona saw her first a shape moving low along the canyon wall well past midnight. Careful, deliberate, forward. The movement of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly which shadows to trust. She woke Silas without waking anyone else, whispering the news like it might shatter if spoken too loud. She's done it before, Halona said. 3 times now. I didn't say anything. Didn't want to believe what it looked like. What's it look like? Halona's face in the dim starlight was tight with something between fear and guilt. Like she's meeting someone outside the canyon, with soldiers a half day out. You're sure it's her? I'd know Atuha's walk, in pitch dark. She favors her right leg ever since a horse threw her 2 winters back. Nobody else in this camp walks like that. Silas felt something cold settle low in his chest. Because if Atuha was passing information position, numbers, the second spring, any of it, then everything he'd built these past 3 weeks, every hour of trust earned inch by inch, was about to collapse in a single night. Because trust, he was learning all over again, wasn't a thing a person earned once and kept forever. It was a thing rebuilt fresh every single day, fragile as spring water, and one bad night could undo 3 weeks of mended fences faster than any drought. Except something about that explanation didn't sit right either. Atuha hated soldiers with a purity that couldn't be faked. Had buried a mother because of what men in uniform had done to this camp's trade routes. A woman like that didn't turn traitor for convenience. Which meant, whatever she was doing out there in the dark, it probably wasn't the thing it looked like. Probably. Silas hoped to God it wasn't, anyway, because the alternative put every soul in this canyon in more danger than a dozen soldiers ever could. He followed her. He found her a mile beyond the canyon mouth, crouched low behind a boulder, trading something small, a folded cloth bundle with a man Silas recognized instantly as one of the hide hunters he'd fought off weeks before, the one who'd gone down hardest under a swinging fence post. Silas's hand went to the rifle at his hip before his mind fully caught up with the scene. "Don't," Atuha hissed, spotting him before he'd taken 3 steps closer. Calder, "Don't. It's not what it looks like." "Then tell me what it looks like." The hide hunter, sensing the shift in the air, backed his horse a nervous step. "We done here?" "We're done." Atuha snapped, not looking at him, eyes locked on Silas instead, like she was deciding, in real time, whether to fight or explain. The rider melted back into the dark without another word, leaving the two of them alone in the cold desert night, the bundle still clutched tight in Atuha's fist. "Talk," Silas said. "Fast. Because right now this looks exactly like the thing that gets a person shot around here. And I'd rather not be the one holding the rifle when Onawa finds out." "You'd shoot me?" "Didn't say that." "Sounded like you said that." "I said I'd rather not be the one holding the rifle. There's a difference." He kept his voice level, kept his hands visible, kept every instinct that had kept him alive this long, patience instead of panic. "Talk to me, Atuha." Atuha's composure cracked, all at once, the anger draining out of her face and leaving something rawer underneath. "My brother," she said, voice shaking now. "He's alive. That man's crew took him 8 months back during a raid on our old camp. Been holding him since. Every trade I make buys another month of him staying breathing instead of buried." Silas went very still. "You've been ransoming your own brother," he said. "Alone. For 8 months. Didn't think anyone would believe me if I asked for help." Ituha's jaw trembled, fury and grief, tangled too close together to separate. "Didn't think anyone would believe a hide hunter's word over mine either. Once they heard I'd been meeting one in secret. Easier to let people think what they wanted, even if what they thought could get you killed. Especially then." She looked at him, something desperate and exhausted in her eyes. "You going to tell Onawa? What's in the bundle?" Atuha hesitated, opened her fist slow and showed him. A handful of silver pieces, worn thin, along with a small carved figure, a horse, crude but careful, whittled by hands that had clearly practiced the shape many times before getting it right. "He makes these," she said, voice cracking now for the first time. "Sends one back every trade, so I know he's still." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Silas exhaled, long and slow, the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes draining out of him all at once. "I'm going to tell her the truth," he said. "Because secrets like this get people killed faster than soldiers do. But I'm going to help you first. Whatever it takes to get your brother clear of that man's crew, you've got my word on it." Atuha stared at him a long moment, like she was recalculating everything she'd decided about him over the last 3 weeks in real time. "Why?" she said finally. "Why would you help me? After everything I've said to you?" "Because I know what it costs a person to carry something alone," Silas said quietly. "Carried my own grief that for 4 years. Nearly buried me standing up. Wouldn't wish that particular weight on anyone. Not even someone who's spent 3 weeks glaring at me like I stole something from her." Something in Atuha's face broke, just slightly, at that. "I didn't glare at you because I hated you," she said. "I glared at you because trusting you felt like betraying every reason I had left to keep fighting." And now? Now I don't know what I feel. She wiped at her eyes, fast, embarrassed by the motion. Ask me again after tonight's over, I will. Don't make it a habit, Calder. Being decent to me, I won't know how to act. Despite everything, despite the fear still sitting cold in his chest, Silas felt something close to a smile pull at his mouth. Noted. They walked back toward camp together in silence. The desert cold and vast around them, stars beginning to fade toward the first gray hint of dawn. Halfway there, Ituha spoke again, quieter, this time, like she was testing whether the words would hold weight out loud. You never told me why you understand it, she said, carrying grief alone. You said it like you'd lived it, not just guessed at it. I told you already. Lost my wife and daughter. That's not what I mean. She glanced at him sideways. Anyone can lose someone. Not everyone carries it the way you do, like it's still happening, every single day, instead of something that already finished happening. I walked several paces before he answered that, because she wasn't wrong, and being seen that clearly by someone who'd spent 3 weeks despising him on principle was its own strange kind of unsettling. I wasn't there, he said finally, when the fever took them. Was 200 miles off, on a job I didn't need the money for badly enough to justify being gone. Told myself I'd make it up to them when I got back. His voice roughened. Never got the chance. And a man carries a thing like that, different than ordinary grief. Ordinary grief, you mourn what you lost. Mine, I mourn what I lost and what I could have prevented. All tangled together so tight I've never managed to separate the two. Ituha was quiet a long moment. That's why you ran toward the gunfire, she said. Weeks back with the hide hunters. Probably. And why you told me you'd help instead of turning me in. Probably that, too. He managed a tired, honest half-smile. Turns out, guilt makes a man useful if he points it in the right direction instead of just letting it rot. Silas told Anawa everything the next morning. Ituha's brother, the trades, the reason behind 3 weeks of midnight disappearances that had nearly cost a woman her place in this camp. Anawa listened without interrupting, her face unreadable until he finished. She should have told me, she said finally. I know what she was afraid of. Anawa's jaw tightened. Doesn't make it easier to hear that fear ran deeper than her trust in me. I've led this camp since we lost the last of our men 3 years back. Thought I'd built something safe enough that no one had to carry secrets like that alone. You have, Silas said. She just didn't believe it applied to her. Some griefs make a person feel like the exception to every kindness going around. I'd know. Anawa's eyes met his, something soft moving behind the usual sharpness. You'd know, she agreed quietly. They spent the rest of that day preparing, the whole camp moving with the grim efficiency of people who'd done this before and wished, bitterly, that they didn't have the practice. Rifles cleaned and distributed, arrows fletched by the dozen. The herd moved as far from the likely line of fire as the canyon's walls allowed. Nashota laid out her medical supplies with the calm precision of a woman who'd long ago stopped, hoping she wouldn't need them. That evening, Silas found Onawa alone at the ridge, watching the horizon where Briggs's column had last been sighted. Scared? He asked, settling beside her. Always. She didn't look at him. Fear's not the enemy, Calder. Complacency is. I stopped being scared once, years back, right before we lost everything that mattered. Never made that mistake twice. Smart woman. Tired woman. A ghost of dry humor colored her voice. Sometimes, those looked the same from a distance. They sat in silence a while, the desert cooling fast around them, stars beginning their slow climb into the darkening sky. Whatever happens tomorrow, Silas said finally, I need you to know I meant what I told you about choosing this place. Every day I wake up here, I choose it again. Anawa turned to look at him then, something raw and unguarded crossing her features before she caught it and steadied herself. Don't say things like that the night before a fight, Calder. Sounds too much like a man saying goodbye. Wasn't goodbye. Was a promise. Same difference, some nights. But she reached over in the dark and held it there a long moment before either of them spoke again. Neither of them slept much that night. Neither of them needed to say why. Tonight, as it turned out, wasn't going to give either of them the luxury of waiting. The attack came at first light, faster and harder than anyone in camp had braced for, riders pouring through the canyon mouth in a wave of dust and gunfire. Briggs's column arriving a full day earlier than Silas's scouting had estimated, whether by luck or by a leak in information neither of them yet understood. The camp exploded into motion. Women grabbing bows, rifles, knives, falling into defensive positions they'd clearly drilled 100 times before Silas ever arrived to see it. Helona's arrow found a rider's shoulder before he'd even cleared the canyon throat, her small frame steady behind an overturned cart, hands moving fast, sure, nothing like the 19-year-old who'd once teased him about a fence knot. Nashota, of all people, stood calm as still water at the med tent's entrance, already laying out what supplies remained, her voice cutting clean through the chaos to direct the wounded before they'd even finished falling. Silas grabbed the nearest rifle and ran toward the sound of the worst of it, toward Onawa's voice cutting through chaos like a blade, directing fire, directing retreat where retreat made sense, directing every soul in that camp with a clarity that took Silas's breath, even in the middle of gunfire. Because this was not a woman who fell back easy. This was a woman who'd buried a husband, a village, an entire way of life, and had decided, somewhere in that grief, that she would never again let anyone take something from her without paying dearly for the privilege. Silas fought beside her. Fought the way he hadn't fought in 8 years, not with the hollow, mechanical obedience of a soldier following orders, but with something fierce and personal and entirely his own. A rider came at him from the left, and he put the man off his horse with a shot that felt nothing like the ones he'd fired under Briggs's command all those years ago. Those shots had been obligation. This one was choice. He saw Briggs once, mid-battle, astride his horse at the canyon mouth, directing his own men with that same infuriating, unshaken calm. Their eyes met across 50 yards of chaos. Something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or the old dread of two men who both knew exactly how this story had ended once before. Briggs didn't call the retreat this time. Didn't need to. His men were winning ground, slow but steady, pressing the camp's defenders back toward the water trough and the herd beyond. The fighting narrowed into something desperate and close, hand to hand in places where ammunition had run thin. Silas caught sight of an older woman, the same one who'd questioned the move at council 2 nights before, standing her ground over a fallen comrade, rifle swinging like a club when the bullets gave out. Caught sight of Onawa, blood streaked along one cheek from a graze she hadn't stopped to notice, still calling orders, still holding the line. Near the med tent, Nashota had abandoned her calm entirely, dragging a wounded woman back from the front of the fighting, with strength that belied her years, shouting instructions to 2 younger women, who scrambled to help without hesitation. A shot went wide of her by less than a foot, close enough to spray dust across her shoulder, and she didn't so much as flinch, didn't break stride, just kept pulling the wounded woman clear, like the bullet had simply been weather to walk through. Helona had run out of arrows somewhere in the chaos and taken up a fallen rifle instead, hands steady despite everything, dropping a rider at 30 yards with a shot that made even Silas, mid-fight, spare half a second of astonishment for the girl who'd taught him a fence knot 3 weeks back. And then he saw Ituha. It was Ituha who broke first, not from cowardice but from position pinned behind a collapsed section of fence. Rifle empty, a hide hunter's rifle swinging toward her with nothing between them but bad luck and worse timing. Silas saw it a half second before it happened. Everything slowed the way it only does in the worst moments of a man's life. The hunter's finger tightening, Ituha's face frozen, too far from cover to move in time. The particular helplessness of watching a disaster arrive 1 full second before you can stop it. Except this time he could stop it. Except this time he wasn't standing on a hillside half a mile away, following someone else's order to look the other direction. This time he was close enough. This time it was his choice to make, and his alone. He didn't think, didn't calculate the odds, didn't weigh his own safety against hers, just ran the distance flat out and put his body between the barrel and Atua's chest a breath before the shot landed. The impact spun him sideways, fire tearing through his side, hot and sudden and absolute. He went down hard, vision swimming, distantly aware of Ituha, screaming something he couldn't quite parse over the ringing in his ears. Calder, her hands were on him, pressing hard against the wound, blood dark and fast between her fingers. Stay with me. Stay, don't you dare. Wasn't planning on going anywhere, he managed, the words costing him more than they should have. You idiot, you absolute. Why would you? Wasn't going to lose someone else. His vision was starting to gray at the edges, but he held her gaze anyway, held it like it was the only solid thing left in a world gone soft and spinning. Not again. Not while I still had the choice to stop it. Above them, the fight was turning. Onawa's voice, closer now, sharper, rallying the last of the defenders in a final push that drove the attackers back toward the canyon mouth in a scattered, bloodied retreat. Silas didn't see the end of it. The world had narrowed down to Itua's hands on his side, and the gray creeping in at the edges of his vision, and somewhere past that, she just looked at him, and Anawa's voice calling his name like it was the only word left in the world worth saying. He woke sometime later in the med tent, the fight already over, the smell of smoke and blood still hanging thick in the air outside. Nashota worked over him with quiet, efficient hands, cleaning and packing the wound with a focus that didn't leave room for gentleness. Only precision. Silas gritted his teeth against it and said nothing, because he'd learned by now that a healer's silence usually meant she was concentrating on keeping you alive, not on comforting you through it. "You'll live," Nashota said finally, tying off the last of the bandage. "Barely. Bullet missed everything that mattered by less width than I'd like to think about. Feels like it missed by considerably less than that. Feelings and facts rarely agree in my experience." She allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "Rest. That's an order, not a suggestion." Beyond her, at the tent's entrance, he could hear voices raised in argument. The camp, still shaken, still sorting through what had nearly happened, what had happened, and what it meant. Moose. He took that bullet for Ituha. Halona's voice, fierce, defending. "You all saw it. Doesn't erase what he was still capable of hiding," another voice countered. "He wasn't hiding anything." Ituha's voice, unexpected, cutting through the argument with an authority Silas hadn't heard from her before. "I was the one hiding something. My brother's alive, held by the same crew that attacked our herd weeks back. Calder found out last night and covered for me instead of turning me in. Whatever debt this camp thinks he still owes, I owe him more." A stunned silence followed that confession, thick enough that Silas could feel it even through canvas walls. Halona's voice broke the silence first, quieter now. No longer arguing but reaching. "Why didn't you tell me? I would have helped. I would have found a way." "Because you're 19 and reckless, and I couldn't stomach the thought of you getting hurt trying to fix something that was mine to carry," Ituha answered, her voice rough with an honesty that clearly cost her something to give. "Didn't want you to lose anyone else. You've already lost enough people you shouldn't have had to. That wasn't your choice to make for me. I know that now." A pause heavy with things neither of them had said aloud before. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Halona said, "Shoot." And Silas could hear, even through canvas, the sound of an embrace being offered and accepted. "Be honest next time. That's all I ask." Then Anawa's voice cutting through all of it, final and unshakable. "He bled for this camp today," she said. "Same as any of us. I don't care what doubts anyone's still carrying. From this day forward, nobody in this camp questions Silas Calder's place here again. Not while I'm standing." Silence followed. Then, slowly, the argument dissolved into something quieter, something closer to agreement. Silas closed his eyes again, the pain and exhaustion pulling him back under, but not before he caught Onawa slipping into the tent, kneeling beside him, her hand finding his in the dim light without a word spoken between them. "You could have died," she said softly, once Nashota had stepped out to give them what privacy the moment demanded. "Didn't though. That's not the same as being careful." He managed a faint, tired smile. "Ituha needed someone in the way of that shot. I happened to be closest. Convenient excuse. Wasn't an excuse. Was a choice." His voice softened. "Same as every choice I've made since that arrow nearly took my hat off 6 weeks back. I choose this camp, Onawa. Choose it every single day I wake up still breathing. Today just cost a little more than usual." Onawa's grip on his hand tightened, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Outside, the desert wind carried the last of the battle's dust away into the darkening sky. But Silas understood, even half-conscious, even bleeding, that this was only the beginning of what Briggs and Wexler had set in motion. The dust from today's fight would settle. The dust from what was coming next would not. 2 days later, strong enough to sit upright if not yet to stand for long, Silas asked Nashota to bring him the forged orders from where they'd been tucked away in the storage tent. He spread them across his lap in the thin morning light and studied them again. The scorched requisition slip, Wexler's smudged signature, the whole ugly architecture of a plan that had nearly buried him twice over now. "You're thinking again," Nashota observed, watching him from across the tent. "Dangerous habit for a man in your condition, Can't help it. Silas turned the papers over once more. Briggs retreated 8 years ago because somebody gave him bad information, or because he was too cautious to risk his men on uncertain ground. This time he didn't retreat. This time he pressed the attack hard, fast, like a man under pressure, to finish something quickly. Meaning. Somebody's pushing him. Same as somebody pushed Wexler to forge those orders in the first place. Silas's jaw tightened. This isn't just an old grudge anymore, Nashota. This is bigger than me, bigger than this camp, and I don't think Briggs is going to stop coming just because we won one fight. Nashota was quiet a moment, her eyes steady on his. Then you'll need to be stronger than you are now before he comes again. I know. And smarter than you've been if you mean to end this instead of simply surviving it. Silas looked down at the papers in his lap, proof of a lie that had nearly cost him everything, and might yet cost this camp everything besides, if he didn't find a way to turn it against the men who'd built it. I know that too, he said quietly. Outside, the desert stretched wide and gold under a sky finally, mercifully, beginning to threaten rain. But Silas understood, watching the clouds gather distant and slow along the horizon, that whatever relief the weather might bring, it wouldn't touch the storm, still building somewhere out past the ridgeline. That storm had a name, 2 names in fact, and neither one of them was finished yet. Rain came 3 days after the fight. Not much. Not enough to fill the dead spring back to what it once was, but enough to darken the canyon walls, enough to fill the cracked mud with something other than dust, enough to remind Silas Calder, lying still in the med tent with a wound that ached every time he breathed too deep, that even a place this hard-worn could still be shown mercy once in a while. He watched it through the tent flap, gray sheets slow over red rock, and thought about Briggs, thought about Wexler, thought about the patient, deliberate cruelty of men who built their power out of other people's silence, and how rain never seemed to fall on men like that, quite as hard as it fell on everyone standing beneath them. He thought, too, about Onawa's hand in his, the night of the raid, about the strange, stubborn ache in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet still healing beneath his ribs. 4 years he'd told himself he was finished with wanting anything that could be taken away again. Except here he was, flat on his back in a healer's tent, discovering that some part of him had apparently never stopped wanting it at all, had just been waiting, patient as this canyon itself, for something worth the risk to finally arrive, which terrified him more than Briggs's column ever could, because a bullet only threatened the body. This threatened something he'd spent 4 years convincing himself he no longer possessed. Nashota found him awake, staring at nothing, and set a cup of something bitter and green into his hands without asking whether he wanted it. "Drink," she said. "Whether you want to or not. You always this generous with your patients? Only the ones who insist on thinking themselves half to death instead of resting." She sat beside him, arms crossed, studying his face with the quiet sharpness of a woman who'd spent 40 years learning to read what people didn't say. "You're not thinking about the wound. You're thinking about what comes after it." Silas didn't deny it. Didn't have the energy to. "Briggs isn't finished," he said. "Men like him don't retreat because they lost one fight. They retreat to plan a better one. Then we'll be ready for the better one." Ready costs more than courage, Nashota. Costs information. And right now I've got half a puzzle and a growing certainty that the missing half is going to get somebody killed before this is over. Nashota's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then find the missing half," she said. "You've got 2 good hands and a mind that hasn't stopped working since the moment you rode into this canyon. Use them." He started with the requisition slip. 3 weeks he'd carried it folded into his coat, staring at Wexler's smudged signature so many times the ink had nearly worn thin from the friction of his own thumb. Crates of rifles, numbered, dated, a quantity that made no sense for a single supply outpost's needs. A destination scratched out so thoroughly it had torn the paper clean through. Silas had assumed all this time that the scratched-out destination was simple carelessness. A man in a hurry, covering his tracks sloppily. Sitting with it now, turning it slow in the gray afternoon light, he realized his mistake. Because the tear wasn't sloppy. The tear was deliberate. Cut clean along a fold in a way that removed exactly one word and nothing else. Which meant somebody hadn't been hiding carelessness. Somebody had been hiding a single, specific piece of information they'd judged too dangerous to leave intact. He held the paper to the light until the faint pressure marks beneath the tear became visible, the ghost of letters pressed hard enough by a heavy hand to leave their shape behind even after the ink itself was gone. 2 words, barely legible. A place name. Vargas Crossing. Silas sat with that a long moment, cold clarity settling over him the way it only did when a puzzle finally clicked into a shape he recognized. Vargas Crossing sat 40 miles south, hard against the border, a lawless stretch of territory where 3 different jurisdictions argued so bitterly over authority that none of them actually exercised any. The kind of place a man moved stolen rifles through if he wanted them to disappear into buyers who asked no questions and left no records, which meant Wexler wasn't simply skimming crates for petty profit anymore. Which meant this was bigger. An organized pipeline, running Army rifles south across the border into hands that had no business owning them, hidden behind the cover of routine supply requisitions that nobody with authority ever bothered checking twice, and Briggs riding hard on a manhunt for a hidden Apache camp that officially didn't exist on any map. Briggs, whose column had somehow known exactly where to find a canyon that was never supposed to be found at all. Briggs made a very convenient distraction for anyone, hoping nobody looked too closely at what else was moving through this territory at the same time. He brought it to Onawa that evening, spreading the papers between them at the fire, watching her study each piece with the same careful patience she brought to everything. "You think Briggs knows," she said. "About the rifles? Don't know yet. Could be he's just following orders same as I once did, blind to what's really moving underneath his own campaign. Could be he's dirty clean through." Silas rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaustion and urgency fighting for the same space behind his eyes. "Either way, exposing Wexler's operation is the only lever I've got left. If I can prove what's really happening at Vargas Crossing, prove it loud enough that it reaches somebody Wexler can't buy off, this whole thing collapses, manhunt included, and if it reaches the wrong hands first, then we're worse off than we started." He met her eyes. "I won't lie to you about the risk, Onawa. This isn't a plan with a guaranteed ending. Few worth pursuing are." She held his gaze a long moment. "There's something you haven't told me yet. I can see it sitting behind your eyes, same way it's been sitting there since the fight 3 days back." Silas exhaled. Slow. "I didn't only find this evidence by accident," he admitted. "Before I ever got sent to this canyon, I'd already started asking questions. About Wexler, about missing crates from 3 different outposts, all routed through the same clerk's signature. I'd been building a case against him for 2 months before that forged assignment ever landed on my desk." Onawa went very still. "You knew, suspected, didn't know the size of it, didn't know he'd go so far as to fake my orders and send me somewhere. He thought I'd simply disappear." His jaw tightened. "I should have told you sooner. Should have told you the whole shape of this the first week, instead of letting you believe I stumbled into your canyon by pure accident." "You did stumble into it by accident," Onawa said slowly, working through it. "Just not the kind of accident either of us assumed." "No," Silas agreed. "Wexler meant to bury me somewhere nobody would ever find the body. Didn't count on the somewhere being occupied by 40 women who decided, against every hard lesson their lives had taught them, that a stranger might deserve 7 days to prove himself instead of a shallow grave." His voice softened. "I owe you the truth, Onawa. All of it. Even the parts that make me look like I wasn't as honest with you as I should have been." Onawa studied him a long moment, her expression caught somewhere between anger and forgiveness, unwilling yet to settle on either. "You should have told me," she said finally. "But I understand why you didn't. A man doesn't hand a woman proof of his own investigation into a dangerous man's crimes in his first week as a prisoner, hoping it buys him goodwill. That's not honesty. That's leverage." Her expression softened, just slightly. "You told me when it mattered. When trusting he meant something more than survival. I can work with that. Thought you might." "Don't get comfortable," Calder. But there was warmth beneath the words this time, unmistakable, the kind that hadn't been there the first week at all. "You're still going to explain every secret you're carrying eventually, one at a time, if that's what it takes. Fair trade." The plan came together over the next 2 days, built from equal parts Apache knowledge of this land and Silas's years reading terrain like other men read scripture. They wouldn't wait for Briggs to come to them a second time. Instead, they'd force his hand send word through channels Wexler couldn't intercept, straight to a territorial judge, 2 counties over known for his stubborn refusal to look the other way on Army corruption, carrying proof of the Vargas Crossing pipeline, detailed enough that no amount of buying off could quiet it once it reached his desk. And while that message traveled, they'd prepare the canyon itself to make any second attack costly enough that Briggs's remaining men would think twice about following him into it. "You want us to fight from the rocks," Ituha said, Studying the map Silas had sketched into the dirt, she'd healed faster than anyone expected from the fright of the raid, though something in her had softened permanently. Since that night beyond the canyon mouth, less armor, more openness, the ease of a person who'd finally stopped carrying a secret alone. "I want us to fight smart," Silas said. "Canyon walls funnel riders into a narrow approach. We control the high ground. We control the fight before it starts. Won't need to win through strength alone if we win through position, and if they bring more men than last time, then position matters even more." He traced a line through the dirt. Rock slides here and here. Triggered, not accidental. Enough to block the wider approach and force everything through the narrow one, where a dozen defenders can hold off 50 attackers if the ground's on their side. Anawa studied the map a long moment. "You scouted this canyon for the army once. You're using that same knowledge against them now. Poetic, isn't it?" Something dark and tired crossed Silas's face. "Spent years learning how to move armies through country like this. Never once thought I'd spend that knowledge keeping an army out instead." Helona knelt beside the map, tracing the narrow approach with one careful finger. "What about us? What do you need from the ones who aren't fighting on the front line?" "Everything," Silas said. "Runners between positions, so nobody's fighting blind. Someone tracking ammunition, making sure the defenders holding longest don't run dry at the worst possible moment. And somebody watching the ridge behind us, in case Wexler's people try coming at us from a direction we haven't planned for. And do the ridge. Figured you might say that." He almost smiled, despite everything. "You've got good eyes, Helona. Better instincts than most soldiers I served with. But this isn't a fence knot. Mistakes out there cost more than a little rope." "I know exactly what they cost," Helona said. Something steadier and older than her years settling into her voice. "Watched you nearly die for this camp already. Watched Ituha carry a secret alone for 8 months. Because she didn't trust us enough to help her carry it. I'm done being the girl everyone protects instead of the woman who protects back." Silas studied her a long moment, seeing, not for the first time, how far she'd traveled from the curious teenager who'd corrected his knot tying that first week. "The ridge is yours," he said. "Don't make me regret it. Wasn't planning on it." It was Nashoda who found the second piece of the puzzle, 2 mornings later, arriving at Silas's tent with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something close to urgency, rare enough on that steady, unshakable face that had stopped him cold before she'd said a word. "A rider came through at dawn," she said. "One of the hide hunter's men, the one Ituha used to trade with." Silas sat up too fast, the wound in his side protesting sharply. "Why, he wants to talk. Says his crew's falling apart. Says the man who led them is dead. Killed in a dispute over payment from whoever's been buying the smuggled rifles at Vargas Crossing. Says the rest of them want out before they're next." Nashoda's expression tightened. "Says he knows where they're keeping a captive. A young man held for ransom. Matches everything Ituha's described about her brother." Silas was on his feet before the sentence finished, ignoring the fire in his side, already moving toward where Ituha stood at the herd's edge, unaware yet that the last 8 months of her life were about to change entirely. The negotiation happened at the canyon mouth, cautious on both sides. Rifles never quite lowered but never quite raised either. The hide hunter, younger than Silas remembered from the fight, weeks back, and considerably more frightened now than he'd been swinging a rifle at defenseless women, spoke fast, eager to trade information for safe passage away from a collapsing operation. "Wexler's crew is coming apart," he said. "Word's out the army's sniffing around Vargas Crossing. Everybody's running for cover, cutting loose anything that ties back to them. That includes the captive. Nobody wants the weight of a kidnapping charge on top of smuggling. Not with lawmen suddenly interested." "Where is he?" Ituha demanded, voice tight and controlled in a way that cost her everything to maintain. 2 days south. Small camp, minimal guard now that half the crew's already scattered." The hunter's eyes flicked nervously between Ituha and Silas. "I'll take you there myself, in exchange for passage clear of whatever's about to happen to this territory." Onawa's voice cut in, hard and final. "You'll take us there. And if it's a trap, you'll be the first one to answer for it." "It's not a trap." The hunter swallowed hard. "I've got no love left for Wexler's operation. Just want clear of it before the whole thing burns down around everybody still standing inside it. Why should we trust a man who once rode with the crew that took her brother in the first place?" Silas said, voice flat, unreadable. "You shouldn't." The hunter's honesty, at least, seemed genuine. "But you don't have a faster way to find him, and I don't have a safer way out of this territory than proving useful to the people who just beat my old crew twice running. Seems like a fair trade, way I see it. Fair trade cuts both ways, Itua said. You lead us true, we let you walk. You lead us wrong, you won't walk anywhere again. The hunter nodded fast, sweat beading despite the cool morning air. Understood. Ituha looked to Silas, something desperate and hopeful warring in her expression. I have to go. Then we go together, Silas said. You're not doing this one alone, not after everything. The camp, when they found it 2 days later, was exactly as small and undefended as the hunter had promised 3 men, none of them expecting trouble, all of them too aware of their crumbling operation to put up much of a fight when Silas and Ituha came through the tree line with rifles raised. Ituha's brother sat bound near a dying fire, thinner than she'd braced for, older in the eyes than the 8 months should have made him, but alive, breathing, looking up at the sound of footsteps with an expression that shattered, all at once, into something too raw for words when he recognized his sister's face. Kesagasio was, Ituha breathed, dropping to her knees beside him, hands shaking too hard to work the ropes properly. Silas knelt and cut them clean instead, giving the 2 of them the moment his own hands couldn't offer. Neither of them said anything for a long while. Just held on, the kind of silence that belongs to 2 people who'd both privately feared, more nights than either would ever admit, that this reunion would never come. You came, Kesgawas finally managed, voice rough with disuse. 8 months. I told myself you wouldn't. Told myself to stop hoping, so it would hurt less if I was right. I never stopped, Ituha said fiercely. Not once. Not for a single day. How, he asked, still barely able to believe it. How did you find me? A man who was sent to us by mistake, Ituha said, glancing at Silas with something warm and grateful passing between them, turned out to be exactly the mistake we needed. Keskawasi studied Silas a long moment, taking in the rifle, the weathered face, the hard-earned steadiness of a man who'd clearly earned his sister's trust the hard way. Thank you, he said simply. Whatever debt that costs, I intend to repay it. No debt, Silas said. Just glad we found you before it was too late. Silas stood back and let them have it, that fragile, overwhelming reunion, and felt something loosen in his own chest watching it unfold. Because there was a particular kind of grace in helping someone else's family find their way back together, even when his own remained forever out of reach. Some griefs, he was learning, could be honored by helping someone else avoid living through the same one. They returned to the canyon 4 days later, Ituha's brother weak but recovering, the whole camp gathering to witness a homecoming nobody had dared hope for. Halona wept openly. Nashota examined Kesegawas with brisk, efficient care that couldn't quite hide the emotion underneath it. Even Onawa, usually so composed, allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile at the sight. But the celebration was brief, cut short by news that had been waiting for their return. The judge's response had come. A rider Silas had paid handsomely back in Cutter's Bend, arrived at the canyon mouth with a single folded letter, and the words inside it settled over Silas like cold water. The judge had received the evidence, had opened an inquiry into Vargas Crossing, had issued orders for Wexler's immediate arrest. But orders took time to reach the men who'd carry them out, and Briggs's column, according to the rider's own report, was already moving again closer this time, harder, driven by a desperation that suggested somebody had warned him. The ground beneath his feet was starting to crumble. He knows he's out of time, Onawa said, reading the letter over Silas's shoulder. Whatever's coming, it's coming, because he's got nothing left to lose by finishing this quickly. Then we finish it first, Silas said. On our terms, before he arrives with nothing left to lose and every reason to burn this canyon down, trying to erase the evidence walking around inside it. They met Briggs's column at the canyon's narrow mouth. 2 days later, the traps set, the high ground held, every defender positioned exactly where months of careful preparation had placed them. Silas spent the morning before the column arrived in a strange, hollow calm he didn't entirely trust. Checked his rifle 3 times, though he already knew it was clean. Checked the rockslide triggers twice, though Ituha had confirmed them steady the night before. Because a man's hands need something to do when his mind won't stop circling the same handful of terrible possibilities. Because if this failed, it wouldn't just be his life on the line. Would be Onawa's, Halona's, every soul in that canyon who'd voted against every hard lesson their lives had taught them to give him 7 days instead of a shallow grave. And now he was about to gamble every one of those lives on the thin, uncertain hope that a man he'd once followed blindly into disaster might, 8 years later, choose differently. Except there wasn't another way. Except waiting only handed Briggs more time to arrive with nothing left to lose. Except the only version of this morning where anyone walked away whole was the version where Silas rode out first alone and forced the choice into daylight before fear could talk either of them out of making it. Onawa found him checking his rifle a fourth time and gently took it from his hands. "It's clean," she said. "Has been for an hour." "Habit." "Fear," she corrected, not unkindly. "Same as the fear I'm carrying right now, watching you about to ride out there alone. Somebody's got to." "I know." She held his gaze steady despite everything. "Doesn't make it easier to watch." "Come back," she said finally, simple and fierce. "Whatever happens out there, find your way back to me." Always intended to. Silas rode out alone to meet him, unarmed. Hands visible, the same posture he'd worn the day 40 arrows had first found him on this same stretch of ground. Briggs reined in 20 yards out, studying him with an expression that hadn't changed in 8 years. That same infuriating, unshaken calm, the posture of a man who'd built his entire identity on never once looking uncertain in front of anyone. "Calder." Briggs said the name like tasting something long buried. "Heard you were dead. Heard it from a clerk back in Cutter's Bend." Matter of fact. Man seemed awfully certain of it. Wexler's certain of a lot of things that turn out wrong. Silas kept his voice level, though every instinct in him wanted to shake. "You know why you're really here, Captain?" "I'm here on orders. Hidden Apache camp. Hostile territory. Standard, you're here because Otis Wexler's been running Army rifles across the border through Vargas Crossing for the better part of a year, and your manhunt made a very convenient distraction while he did it." Silas let that land, watched something flicker behind Briggs's carefully composed face. A judge 2 counties over. Already issued arrest orders. "Whatever you finish here today, Captain, it won't save Wexler. It'll only decide what it costs you personally." Briggs's jaw tightened. "You're bluffing. Wasn't my style 8 years ago, isn't now either." Silas held his gaze, unflinching. "You remember that village, Briggs? You remember the order you gave and the smoke we rode away from without looking back?" Something shifted in Briggs's expression, the first genuine crack Silas had ever seen in that unshakable composure. "Every day," Briggs said, quieter now. "You think you're the only one who carries it?" "Didn't say that." Silas gestured back toward the canyon behind him, toward the fires, the tents, the sound of 40 women who'd rebuilt an entire life out of ashes men like Briggs and Wexler had left behind. "I'm saying you've got a choice today you didn't have back then. Nobody's ordering you to look away this time. Nobody's forcing your hand. You can ride into that canyon and burn down the first peaceful thing either of us has found since that morning. Or you can look at what's actually there, Captain, and decide for yourself whether it deserves the same ending as the last village you rode away from." The silence stretched long between them, broken only by the wind moving through red rock and the distant watchful stillness of 40 defenders holding position above. "If I stand down," Briggs said, finally, voice rough, "I lose everything. Career, pension, whatever's left of my reputation once word gets out. I let a hidden camp walk free instead of bringing it in. You'll lose all of that anyway once Wexler's arrest brings the whole operation into daylight," Silas said. "Question isn't whether you lose something today, Captain. Question is whether you lose it as the man who finally chose right, or the man who chose wrong twice in the same lifetime." Briggs sat his horse a long, silent moment, looking past Silas toward the canyon, toward the fires and tents and the quiet, watchful shapes of women who had survived more than any official report would ever properly capture. "I can write a report," he said slowly, like each word cost him something physical to produce, "that says the camp I was sent to find no longer exists. Abandoned months back. No hostiles located." His eyes met Silas's, something old and tired and finally honest passing between them. "It'll be a lie. Every word of it. Some lies do more good than the truth ever could." "You'd know something about that," Briggs said. "Seems your whole life's been built on choosing which truths to carry and which to bury." He exhaled, long and slow, the weight of 8 years settling visibly across his shoulders. "Tell your camp to stay quiet a while longer. Give the story time to hold. And call, Captain, I hope whatever you found in there was worth what it's costing me to let you keep it." He turned his column without another word, riding back the way he'd come, and Silas watched him go until the dust settled and the canyon fell silent around him once more. Word of Wexler's arrest reached the canyon 3 weeks later, carried by the same rider who'd brought the judge's original letter. Taken at Vargas Crossing itself, mid-transaction, rifles and ledgers both seized as evidence thorough enough to end any hope of buying his way clear. The operation collapsed entirely within the month, its remaining pieces scattered or arrested in turn. The rider carried something else too, a folded newspaper, clipping from a territorial court, 2 counties over, reporting the conviction plainly without embellishment. Otis Wexler, former Army quartermaster sergeant, found guilty of grand theft, smuggling, and conspiracy, sentenced to a term Silas suspected would outlast whatever bitterness the man still carried toward the corporal who'd first reported him 8 years back. Silas read the clipping twice, then a third time, waiting to feel something larger than the quiet, steady relief that actually arrived. No triumph, no satisfaction sharp enough to call victory, just the simple, worn smooth feeling of a debt finally fully settled. Silas read the report twice, sitting alone at the canyon's edge, and felt something in his chest finally unclenched after 8 long years of carrying it clenched tight, because it was over. Because the man who'd tried to forge was going to spend considerably longer than 7 days answering for it. Because the debt Silas had carried since a hillside 8 years back, the debt of a man who'd followed an order instead of trusting his own conscience, had finally, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, been paid forward into something that looked almost like justice. He found Onawa at the fire that evening and told her all of it, watching relief move slow and unguarded across her face for the first time since he'd known her. "It's finished," she said, like she needed to say it aloud to fully believe it. "This part is." Silas took her hand, steady now, in a way it hadn't been that first fireside conversation, months back, when neither of them had dared name what was building between them. "Rest of it's just beginning, I expect." "Rest of what?" "Whatever comes next. For this camp. For you." He hesitated, his usual steadiness cracking just enough to let something more uncertain through. "For us, if you'll have me stay past whatever debt you think I still owe for the 7 days you gave me at the start of all this." Onawa studied him a long moment, firelight softening the sharp lines of her face into something he'd only ever seen her show at this fire, and never anywhere else. "You already stayed," she said quietly, "weeks ago. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. Say it now." "Stay," Onawa said, simple and certain. "Not because you owe this camp anything. Because I want you here. Because somewhere in the last few months, watching you mend fences and take bullets meant for other people and hate yourself a little less every single day you spent proving you weren't the man your worst mistakes told you that you were somewhere in all of that, I stopped thinking of you as a stranger who got sent here by accident. What do you think of me as now?" "Home," she said. "I think of you as home." Silas didn't have words for what moved through him at that. Didn't need them. Just leaned in, slow, giving her every chance to pull away if this wasn't what she wanted, and found instead that she met him halfway, firelight and 4 years of buried grief finally quietly, giving way to something neither of them had let themselves hope for, in longer than either would admit. The months that followed moved differently than any Silas had known before. Not easier, exactly. Building anything worthwhile rarely was, but different in the way that comes from working towards something instead of simply surviving it. The herd grew first, steady and sure under Silas's careful management, the thin, undernourished cattle of that first desperate season, giving way to a herd healthy enough to trade, not just sustain. Word spread slow through the territory, the way word always did, among people who'd learned to trust cautiously and verify everything twice a camp near the border. Women and one quiet former scout, running cattle fair and trading fairer, worth the ride if a person had goods worth exchanging. Itua's brother recovered fully within the season, and something in Itua herself recovered alongside him, the guarded hostility that had first joined Silas at gunpoint softening over the following months into something closer to genuine friendship. She still teased him relentlessly about the fence knot Halona had once had to correct, still called him idiot on occasion, with unmistakable affection buried beneath the word. "You're better at this than you let on," she told him one afternoon, watching him work alongside Keseg Gowas, mending a section of corral that had held strong through 2 full seasons now. "Better at what?" "Staying." She shrugged, the gesture almost casual, though something warmer lived underneath it. Most men who wander into a place like this either run the first chance they get, or they take without giving back nearly enough to justify the taking. You did neither. High praise, coming from the woman who once threatened to shoot me for getting too close to Helena. Don't let it go to your head, Calder. But she was smiling when she said it, the first real, unguarded smile he'd ever seen cross her face, and Silas understood, watching it, that whatever debt he'd once owed this camp had been repaid many times over by now. Helena grew too, in the way young women do when finally given room enough to become whoever they were always meant to be, instead of simply surviving towards some uncertain future. She took to trading with a natural instinct that surprised even Onawa, negotiating fair prices with visiting ranchers, with a confidence that made Silas remember, with something close to pride, the 19-year-old who'd once corrected his fence knot with total, unshaken certainty. You'll run this whole camp someday, Silas told her, watching her close a particularly favorable trade for winter supplies. Someday's a long way off. But she grinned at the compliment anyway, unable to fully hide how much it meant to her. Besides, somebody's got to keep watching you. Make sure you don't do anything foolish enough to get yourself shot at. That a threat or a promise? Both, Helena said. Learned that particular skill from Ituha. Nashota remained exactly what she'd always been, steady, watchful, the quiet anchor around which the whole camp's healing continued to turn. She never spoke much about her own losses after that first conversation in the med tent, but Silas noticed, over the following seasons, a certain lightness returning to her that hadn't been there the day she'd first tended his old wound and found the deeper one hiding underneath it. You've done well here, Calder, she told him once, unprompted, watching the camp move through an ordinary evening cookfires. Easy conversation, the unhurried music of a community that had rebuilt itself out of loss into something worth protecting. Better than well, if I'm honest. This camp needed more than a scout who knew the land. It needed someone willing to bleed for it, same as the rest of us already had. Just return the kindness you all showed me, Silas said. 7 days, when you had every reason to give me none at all. Kindness returned tends to multiply, in my experience. Nashota's eyes crinkled with something close to warmth. Grief doesn't make you weak, I told you once. Question was whether you'd let it make you useful. Turned out useful, did I? Turned out necessary, she corrected. Different thing entirely. Better thing, too. Silas and Onawa married the following spring, in a ceremony that borrowed pieces from traditions on both sides of who they'd each once been a blending neither of them had planned. But both of them found, in the doing of it, she too felt more honest than choosing only one inheritance over the other. The night before, Silas had stood at the same ridge where he and Onawa had once walked together during his 7 days of trial, watching the sun drop low over land that no longer felt borrowed or dangerous, but entirely, permanently his own. He thought of Eliza then, not with the old grinding guilt that used to accompany her memory, but with something gentler, a gratitude, almost, that the love he'd once known had taught him how to recognize this second, unlikely chance when it finally arrived. He liked to think she'd have approved, liked to think, somewhere past whatever waited beyond this life, she'd have told him exactly what she'd told him that first afternoon at the church social. Everything gets warm if you stand there long enough deciding instead of doing. He'd finally, after 4 hard years, stopped deciding and started doing. The whole camp gathered for it, every woman who'd once voted on whether a stranger deserved 7 days to live now, standing witness to the day he became something closer to family than any could have predicted that first violent evening beside the fire. Helena cried through the entire ceremony, loudly and without embarrassment. Ituha stood beside her brother, both of them healthy and whole in a way that still occasionally struck Silas as something closer to miracle than mere good fortune. Nashota watched from near the front with the quiet satisfaction of a healer who'd tended every wound that led to this moment, physical and otherwise, and found the whole slow process worth every difficult hour it had cost. You may not have believed me. 7 months back, Onawa said quietly, as they stood together at the ceremony's close, when I told you standing wasn't the same as living. Believe you now, Silas said. Took some convincing, but I believe you now. What convinced you? You did. This whole camp did. He looked out over the gathered faces. 40 women fewer now, since some had chosen to leave for safer territory. Once peace held steady, but more too, as word spread and others in need of shelter found their way here instead. Spent 4 years thinking the only thing left for me was to keep moving until moving itself killed me. Instead, I got lost on purpose, or by accident, or by whatever cruel and generous hand arranges these things, and ended up somewhere that gave me back a reason to stop. Was it worth it? Everything it cost to get here? Silas considered that a long moment, watching the sun drop low in gold over Red Canyon walls that had once nearly become his grave and had instead, against every reasonable expectation, become his home. Everything worth having costs something, he said finally. This just happened to cost exactly what I had left to give. Turned out to be enough. 7 years passed the way good years tend to quickly, in memory, though each one had felt long and full while living through it. The camp had grown into something few would have predicted that first desperate season. A proper settlement now, not simply a hidden refuge cattle herds thriving across land that had expanded twice over his trust with neighboring ranches, deepened into genuine partnership. Trade routes that once existed only as desperate midnight exchanges for ransom now ran open and legitimate, connecting this canyon to friendly settlements up and down the territory. And word had spread, quiet but steady, of a place where Apache women and their families could find shelter without judgment or danger, a haven built out of loss, sustained through hard-won trust, protected fiercely by people who understood exactly what it cost to lose everything and refused to let it happen twice under their watch. Silas Calder had stopped being a lonely cowboy long before most of the camp's newer arrivals ever knew that man had existed at all. He was simply Calder now, Onawa's husband, a steady hand with the herds, the man visiting ranchers negotiated with when trade needed settling, the quiet presence who'd once, according to a story told and retold around evening fires, been sent to this canyon entirely by mistake. He sat by that fire most evenings now, same as he had that very first terrifying night 7 years back, though everything about the sitting had changed beyond recognition. Onawa beside him, her hand finding his without either of them needing to think about the gesture anymore. Halona, older now, sharp-eyed and capable, running trade negotiations that made even seasoned ranchers respect her instincts. Ituha and Kesagawas, both fully recovered from everything that had once threatened to break them separately, now inseparable the way siblings become once they've nearly lost each other and refused to take the second chance for granted. Nashota Gray fully claiming her hair now, still steady, still watching over every wound this camp encountered with the same unshaken care she'd once offered a stranger who arrived bound and bleeding at the point of 40 arrows. Newer faces gathered too, drawn by word of a safe haven in Red Canyon country, women who'd lost husbands, brothers, entire villages to the same violence that had once nearly destroyed this camp before Silas ever arrived. They listened, some evenings, as the older members told the story of how it all began. "Tell it again," a young woman asked one evening, newly arrived, still carrying the hollow-eyed grief of someone who hadn't yet learned this place could hold her safely. The story about the man who was sent here by mistake. Silas exchanged a look with Onawa, the warm, private amusement of two people who'd told this story so many times it had worn smooth and comfortable, like a stone carried long enough in a pocket to forget its own sharp edges. "Wasn't really a mistake," he said, settling back against the log behind him, firelight catching the gray now, beginning to show at his own temples. "Man who forged my orders meant to bury me somewhere nobody would ever find the body. Sent me to a canyon that wasn't supposed to exist on any map, hoping I'd simply disappear. And instead I found 40 women who'd already survived worse than anything a desperate clerk could throw at them. Found people willing to give a stranger 7 days to prove he wasn't a threat, when every hard lesson their lives had taught them said to shoot first and skip the trial entirely." He glanced at Onawa, something soft and unguarded passing between them even after all these years. "Found a reason to stop running, for the first time since I'd buried everything I thought mattered." The young woman's eyes had softened, listening, some of that hollow grief easing just slightly at the edges. "So it wasn't a mistake," she said slowly. "It was the canyon knew what it was doing," Nashota said, her voice carrying easily across the fire, even when none of the people standing in it yet understood the shape of what was happening. "That's usually how the important things arrive, disguised as accidents, revealed eventually as exactly where we needed to be all along." The young woman looked around the fire, then really looked, taking in the faces gathered close against the desert-cold Halona, confident and capable, once an orphan with nothing but curiosity to carry her forward. Ituha, her brother's shoulder pressed companionably against hers. The guarded fury of that first violent evening, long since softened into something steadier. Nashoda, gray and wise and endlessly patient, still tending every wound this camp encountered, physical and otherwise. Anawa, hand resting easy in Silas's, the fierce young leader who'd once given a stranger 7 days to prove himself, now sharing a life with the very stranger she'd almost had killed. "Will it happen for me too?" the young woman asked quietly, her voice small against the vastness of the fire and the sky beyond it. "Whatever this is, will it find me the way it found all of you?" Anawa reached over, took the young woman's hand the same steady way she'd once taken Silas's, years back, beside a different fire, when neither of them had dared believe healing was still possible for people who'd already lost so much. "It already has," she said gently. "You're here. You're breathing. You're sitting at a fire that exists because enough people before you refuse to let grief have the final word. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually, dressed up small enough to fit inside one ordinary evening." Silas looked around the fire at faces that had become, over 7 long and difficult and ultimately worthwhile years, the only family he'd ever again allow himself to fully claim. Watched Onawa's profile catch the firelight, the same scar on her shoulder he'd first noticed the night this all began. Still there, still hers, still a reminder of everything survived to arrive at this particular evening. They sent him here because of a lie. Because a frightened, corrupt man wanted a witness silenced and thought a hidden canyon was the easiest grave available. But the canyon had never agreed to be anyone's grave. It had simply been waiting, all along, for 2 kinds of loneliness to find each other in the dark and to discover, against every hard lesson either of them had learned the difficult way, that some accidents are simply the universe's clumsy, roundabout way of finally getting something right.